A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. Growing up, Thanksgiving was my favorite holiday. It always meant a table overflowing with food, laughing family members, and the warm scent of pumpkin pie wafting through the air. However, this year was different. My family had grown distant, caught up in life's responsibilities, jobs, and whatever else life threw our way. I was living in a cramped studio apartment, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. So when my sister texted a week before the holiday to say she'd be hosting Thanksgiving, I was filled with a mix of joy and dread. I immediately assumed I'd at least bring dessert or contribute in some way, but when I asked her whether I should pick up a pie, she responded with a strange silence that pinched at my gut. Finally, she texted back, "It's fine, just come," leaving me in a pit of uncertainty. As Thanksgiving approached, I tried my best to prepare mentally. I envisioned my family around the table, laughing over stories from past Thanksgivings, feeling full and happy as I enjoyed their company. Then, I wondered if I could really afford to pitch in this year. I didn't want to seem cheap, but the thought of struggling to make rent mixed with the guilt of not being able to contribute gnawed at me. The evening of Thanksgiving dawned crisp and clear, and I arrived at my sister's house, trying to remember what it felt like for everyone to get together. As I walked through the door, a delicious aroma hit me. The turkey, roasted to perfection, mingled with the sweetness of cranberry sauce and buttery rolls. For a heartbeat, everything felt perfect, and then I noticed something strange. My sister had a pinched smile plastered on her face, and the guests, a mixture of my siblings and their partners, seemed uncharacteristically tense, the clinking of forks muffling the chatter that should have filled the room. I tried to shake off my unease and joined in, eager to dig into the feast. But soon enough, after a few awkward exchanges, my sister announced that a sudden rise in grocery prices this year meant that everyone would need to contribute, which was a strange proclamation considering how we'd always shared the burden as a family. It felt like someone had ripped the joy out of the room. Why did it feel like such a dire situation? I looked around, searching for supportive eyes or someone to break the tension. The shallow laughs only underscored the simmering discontent in my heart. Just as I started to relax, she passed around a collection bowl, glaring at me as if the responsibility to pay for Thanksgiving groceries rested solely on my shoulders. My mind raced, confusion clouding my thoughts. It isn't a potluck if you intend to charge your family to attend. The ambivalence unfolded further as she demanded we each pay an outrageous amount akin to what a meal would cost for a dozen people at a restaurant. I looked at my family's expectant faces. I felt trapped. My heart sank because I would have defended my point without hesitation had this not been my blood. So, I hesitated, caught between the horror of being labeled the cheap sibling and the truth of my situation that left me worrying about bills. Just as I opened my mouth to voice my feelings, a small voice from my youngest niece chimed in, asking why we couldn't all share the joy of spending time together instead of worrying about money. My heart squeezed painfully. I saw my sister's face go pale. I tried to shift the conversation, laughing nervously and sharing a silly story about being trapped in my cramped apartment, but it only felt like digging a deeper hole as my other siblings stared at me in disappointment. I could feel the energy of the room crashing and swirling around me. My pulse quickened, panic began to choke the air. I voiced a quiet AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. Trying to gauge the atmosphere. Unexpectedly, that innocent prompt lit up tension. "Well, maybe if we all pitched in like we used to, we wouldn't have this problem," my sister snapped, her smile long gone, replaced by a deep flush of anger. Before I could speak, the room erupted into a cacophony of arguments, voices tangled in a familial riot, accusations of selfishness, indifference, and entitlement scraping against each other like metal on metal. I recoiled, panic clawing its way up my throat as I desperately tried to understand how my innocent gesture had thrown everyone into chaos. I could have sworn I watched our family fracture in real time, the crushing realization that we had begun to care more about our pride than the warmth of our shared history drowning the last shreds of joy in the room. My niece started crying, and suddenly the world blurred around me. It felt like I was in a nightmare where nothing could be salvaged. I don't know how long I sat quietly afterwards as their voices echoed, part of me desperately wanting to bolt from that house, and yet another part wished to mend the fraying bonds of my family. I took a breath, willing to attempt a peace offering, only to have my sister shout that it wasn't about me, it was about the costs, almost as if she were trying to erase my existence from that evening. I watched as one sibling left in anger, the door slamming shut behind them, a hollow thud that lingered in the air and resonated deep within me. I can't recall how we finally settled down to the meal after that storm. Tension had wrapped itself around the uneaten turkey, the sides untouched, and we grappled through half-hearted cheers, the festive spirit sucked dry. After a painful pause, I left to the bathroom, desperately trying to breathe, and when I looked in the mirror, all I saw were the guilt-laden eyes of the niece I had disappointed, an image that would haunt me long past that evening. I stepped back into the dining room, shifting on my feet, feeling like I had stumbled into a family gathering less than ideal, a space that felt less like home than an echo of what we used to be. The atmosphere stank of resentment. As I murmured a quiet goodbye later, guilt churned, reminding me of people I loved, staring at their half-eaten plates riddled with an anguish that would linger, ready to haunt me as the holidays loom closer. My expectations, rather than bringing me into the fold, had created a rift that would deepen and darken into every Thanksgiving to follow. All that remained was the question, AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. And in the end, the answer was unfathomably clear: it cost more than money to keep a family together. I never considered myself a selfish person, but that all changed the night I found myself face to face with the thing I had cooked, something so ordinary yet so deeply unsettling, and how it pushed me to the brink of sanity. My parents worked long hours, leaving my younger siblings, Ryan, who was 9, and Lily, just 7, under my care, and on that fateful evening, I had taken a rare opportunity to experiment in the kitchen, something they usually encouraged but rarely had time for. I decided to whip up a batch of spaghetti and meatballs, a family classic that I thought they'd devour. The aroma wafted through the house, curling along the walls and wrapping around the corners, promising warmth and satisfaction. But the moment I called them to the table, their faces shifted from curiosity to disgust faster than I could blink. Ryan wrinkled his nose, pushing the plate away, while Lily, in her innocent defiance, declared she'd rather starve. I felt a wave of embarrassment flood my cheeks. After all the effort, after all the chopping and stirring, all I received were pouts and tantrums from 2 kids who would have preferred a cold slice of pizza or, even worse, the remnants of the last week's takeout. I tried reasoning with them, explaining how cooking was hard work, that I put my heart into this dish, but they seemed impervious to my pleas, their whining crescendoing until I felt as if my skin was crawling with irritation. Finally, I snapped, "Fine, if you don't want to eat it, don't. I won't cook you a second meal." The silence that followed was suffocating, but their half-hearted whimpers melted into fake sobs as they pushed their chairs back and skulked away, leaving me to simmer in my frustration alone. I thought they'd go to bed hungry, perhaps even learn a lesson about appreciation. Instead, it seemed I was the one cast as the villain in a twisted fairy tale. After an hour of silence thick enough to cut through, filled with the dread of impending accusations from my parents, I heard a series of soft, rhythmic thuds outside the kitchen window. I approached cautiously, peering out into the darkening yard, feeling an unsettling chill envelop me. To my disbelief, I noticed 2 distinct shapes just beyond the glow of the streetlight, Ryan and Lily, not playing but standing still, their backs towards me. They wore their usual pajamas, but something was off, their postures rigid like puppets with tangled strings. "What are you 2 doing out there?" I called, but they didn't respond, they just stood there, unmoving. A cold fear crept into my stomach. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen flickered, the sudden loss of battery rendering me helpless. I decided I'd had enough of this strange tableau and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my ears as I approached, calling their names again. As I got closer, the silhouette of my siblings twisted into something grotesque, their limbs began to twitch unnaturally, and before I could process it, they turned their heads in unison, their faces contorted into wide, eerie grins that seemed impossible for anyone who wasn't completely lost in madness. "We're not hungry anymore," they screeched in a voice that was neither of them, a chorus of distorted laughter exploding into the stillness of the night. My breath caught in my throat, a primal urge to run surged through me, but I was rooted in place, entranced by this horror unfolding before me. I backed away, but as I turned, I tripped, hitting the ground hard. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so soft I almost didn't catch it. "You said we should learn a lesson." I shot back to my feet and sprinted inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I tried to convince myself it was just a fever dream, that my imagination was running wild due to their refusal to eat, but in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow glide past the window, pacing back and forth as I huddled in a corner like a child afraid of the dark. The incessant tapping began again, this time accompanied by urgent whispers that clawed at my consciousness, a language I couldn't decipher but felt deeply lodged in my psyche. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife, adrenaline coursing as I envisioned defending myself against whatever malevolence had taken hold of my siblings. I screamed their names, but all I got in response was a cacophony that churned in my gut, mocking my distress. As the night dragged on, their laughter echoed in the surrounding darkness, a nightmarish lullaby I couldn't escape. I dared to peek outside, and my heart shattered at the fantasy. They were gone, replaced by an abyss that seemed to yawn before me. Hours passed in a daze, and when dawn finally broke, I curled into a ball on the couch, racked with guilt and dread, unsure if I would face a paranormal nightmare or the wrath of my parents. The light spilled through the window, illuminating the room in a ghostly orange hue. When I summoned the courage to look outside, the yard was empty, devoid of my siblings, free of the twisted realities that had grappled me in the night. They appeared eventually, nonchalant as ever, the peculiar grins faded like the terrors of a waking dream. I didn't mention last night's episode, after all, who would believe me? My parents returned, and everything settled back into the repetitive rhythm of the household, yet a cold thread of tension weaved itself through our lives, quiet moments punctuated by lingering glances and echoes of that laughter, my siblings seemingly unaware of the change in their demeanor, but I recognized the flicker of something darker beneath their innocent facade. Days turned into weeks, and the dread only thickened. I started finding leftovers of food I hadn't made, twisted shapes of Play-Doh-like meat, unrecognizable but oddly reminiscent of what I had cooked, lurking in dark corners. I attempted to make my case known, but it sounded ludicrous, and so I buried the fear beneath daily routines, buried it until it became a constant presence, a reminder of one fateful night when I had refused to nurture. I shivered, often dreaming of the dark laughter that would not let me sleep, forever chained to the guilt that grew like a weed. And one night, when the winds whispered through the cracks of our home, I dared to lay my head in resigned silence, but was pulled back into that heavy absence, my siblings out once more, standing like specters beneath the streetlights, faces illuminated in a sickly hue, as if a portal had cracked open between realms, and I was forced to face a harbinger of dread, knowing that somewhere inside I had sealed our fates the day I decided to abandon the very essence of what it meant to share a meal. As I gazed upon their twisted forms, I desperately wished to retract my words, to cook them anything they wanted, though I feared the cost would be far more than a second dinner, and the shadows hinted that the lesson had only just begun to unravel. I always thought that family gatherings were supposed to be joyful, filled with laughter and love, but for me, they were a reminder of the hollow ache in my heart, a wound that never seemed to heal. I had been married for 3 years, and despite countless doctor's appointments, hormones, and shattered hopes, I still hadn't been able to give my husband what his family craved, a grandchild. It's not that I didn't share their dream. I wanted a child as much as he did, but an insidious cloud of infertility hung over my head like a guillotine, waiting to drop at any moment. At every family dinner, the conversation would inevitably spiral toward the kids my sister-in-law was expecting or the cute stories of my husband's childhood that I had heard 1,000 times, both of which sent a fresh wave of salt water stinging my eyes that I would fight to keep at bay. As the chatter became more pronounced, I noticed the unmistakable glances my mother-in-law would cast my way, the pitying concern pooled in her eyes like the still water of a stagnant pond. I could feel her discomfort, her insistent attempts to engage me in discussions about fertility treatments under the guise of concern and support. I hated it. I hated the unwelcome attention on my most vulnerable secret, the nagging whispers that echoed through my mind. I wasn't just a woman, but a broken cog in her family's wheel. It all came to a head last Thanksgiving, the air thick with expectation as the aroma of roasted turkey drifted into my nostrils like a false promise. After we had feasted, my in-laws gathered in the living room, eyes glistening under the faded twinkle lights, chatting animatedly about future family plans. My heart raced as I sensed the shift in focus toward me, the moment when my mother-in-law cleared her throat, the precursor to her infamous "let's talk about the future" speech. "So, when do you think we might meet our grandchild?" she pried, her voice steady, though I could hear the tremor of underlying desperation. It was as if every pair of eyes turned to me with that question, the words swirling in the air like vultures, scavenging the carcass of my dreams. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks and wanted to sink into the floor, to evaporate, but instead, with a jagged breath, I simply remained silent. My husband shot me a concerned glance, his father deflected with an awkward chuckle, but the damage was done. I felt raw, exposed, and utterly furious. Why should I have to discuss my deepest pain with people who only saw me as a vessel? That evening, as tension simmered beneath the surface, I retreated to the bathroom, clutching the cool porcelain sink, my heart racing as I battled the swirling storm of emotions. The shadows seemed to whisper, urging me to confront my in-laws about the delicate matter, to reveal the truth that felt more sacramental than flesh and blood. But all I could recall was a memory, the time I had briefly shared my struggles with close friends only to hear their casual insensitivity. "You can always adopt," was an unsolicited suggestion that had dug in like nails on a chalkboard. How could I trust anyone with this? Instead of expressing my frustrations, I turned my phone off and avoided them for the rest of the evening, feigning late-night work calls and bathroom breaks to escape their probing questions. When I returned to the living room, the chatter had shifted to other topics: my sister-in-law's baby shower planning, the grand plans summer would bring, all accompanied by the laughter and affection I had once thought unbreakable. I sat back down, feeling smaller than ever as my in-laws and husband conversed with ease, laughter cascading over me like a heavy wool blanket. I couldn't help but think that I had become a ghost in my own life, floating through moments that once filled me with joy but now only reminded me of the family I was struggling to provide. In the days that followed, our house grew quiet, almost painfully so. My husband, kind and patient, tried to forge conversations around my feelings, but all I felt was a wall robbing me of my voice. I became a coward, staring down the never-ending silence whenever my in-laws called or texted. Their messages turned from curious to frustrating, filled with concern that made my skin crawl. A week later, the family WhatsApp group ignited with photographs of my sister-in-law's ultrasound, and a tear slipped down my cheek as I muted the notification, each ping a dagger twisting into my heart. I felt like the villain of my own story, the one who refused to talk about the very thing that drained life from me. In my mind, I played a relentless cycle of what-ifs. What if I talk to them? What if I shatter their dreams? What if I shatter my own? I could feel the weight of family traditions and expectations pressing down on me like I was being submerged underwater, gasping for breath and desperate for release. As the cold chill of winter set in, I avoided attending holiday celebrations, ducking out of every gathering, and insisting on working through the long weekends, all while my heart sank deeper into despair. Then came the shocking twist. One late night, while scrolling aimlessly through social media, I stumbled upon a group dedicated to fertility issues, and suddenly, there it was, a thread that ripped the bandage off the wound I had tried to shield from the world. A woman, vulnerable and raw, told of her struggles and gave voice to the very pain I feared, and I felt it resonate within me like a forgotten song. As the comments poured in, each a testament to the shared struggle, it felt like a glimmer of hope. Until she casually mentioned, "Just remember to communicate with your loved ones, they can't help you if they don't know." Her words clung to the walls of my mind, pressing against the restraints I had put in place. That night, I finally broke down, tears flowing freely as I thought of my husband, the love we shared, and the family I had allowed to slip farther away. The next day, I took a deep breath, my heart still racing, and initiated a text to my in-laws asking them to meet me for coffee. I had finally decided, it was time to talk. The moment my mother-in-law walked into the cafe, I saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, only to be overshadowed by the uncertainty of what lay beneath. We chatted about benign topics for a while, but the air was thick with unspoken words. As the steam from our drinks rose like ephemeral ghosts, I finally opened my mouth, feeling the weight of every word crash down around us like waves against the shore. I spoke of my struggles, the heartache, and the silence that had become my wall. They listened in silence, and in those moments, when the truth laid bare between us, I felt the temperature drop, an awkward pause settling like dust after a storm. To my surprise, after a few beats of silence, my mother-in-law reached across the table, her hand clutching mine, offering more than just sympathy, it was the promise of understanding. I finally began to heal, slowly but surely, yet the path wasn't easy. Some days, I faltered, the weight of expectation still looming over me, but I knew that mothering would come in many forms, perhaps not the expected route, but one that was uniquely mine. As time progressed, I became part of those family conversations, advocating for my own journey to expand our family, while embracing the unexpected joys that awaited us, understanding that familial love is resilient and can be found even in the spaces of discomfort and raw honesty. Sharing my story didn't only help my in-laws understand the pain I carried, it liberated me from its grip, transforming the way we could interact with one another. I wouldn't be the perfect daughter-in-law or the perfect mother, but I would be something far richer, an authentic member of a family that, in its messy, imperfect beauty, could truly embrace one another for who we are. Even after all the pain, I found myself craving those family gatherings, looking forward to laughter, to the inevitable questions, but also knowing that this time, I'd be able to talk about the dreams that had once felt so out of reach. So, AITA for refusing to talk to my in-laws? No, I realized, I was just human, and sometimes it takes a little courage to find the voice that lays dormant within. Last week, I found myself at the crossroads of familial loyalty and gut instinct, torn apart by my father's health issues and the shadow that loomed over his friend Walter, a man who'd slithered into our lives with charm and an unsettling undertone. My father, once vibrant and full of life, had been grappling with aggressive cancer for the past year, and despite the slowly thickening fog of despair that shrouded our home, Walter had introduced himself as a source of comfort under the guise of a devoted ally. I didn't think much of it at first. He showed up with handfuls of flowers, extravagant presents, and what seemed like genuine concern for my father's well-being. Every week, he called to check in, send uplifting messages, and even accompanied my dad to the very first round of treatments. But it wasn't long before I began noticing the little things, the way Walter would linger too long on the fringes of conversations, the crinkle in his smile whenever Dad mentioned me or my accomplishments, a creeping envy that spewed from his otherwise polished demeanor. The essence of his being wrapped itself around my father like an invasive vine, smothering his spirit while nurturing the insatiable thirst for control that lurked behind Walter's friendly facade. So when I found out that Walter had made plans to accompany my dad to his crucial 6-month checkup, a kind of distorted appointment that could either bring a glimmer of hope or the plunge into eternal darkness, my heart clenched tightly in rebellion. I dreaded the idea of relinquishing my protective post, of handing over my father's fragile trust to this man who felt more like a predator than a friend. I consulted my mother, who had been distant and quiet since Dad's diagnosis, and her silence spoke volumes. It was a low-grade anxiety that bubbled just under the surface, a synchronous heartbeat with my own buried fears. That night, I caved into the entangling dread and called the office, leaving a message, insisting that only I would accompany Dad to his appointment. The relief coursing through my veins was short-lived. When the day finally came, I met Walter standing at the front door, a smug smile plastered across his face, as if he had anticipated my next move. My father, clad in one of his favorite flannel shirts, looked caught between confusion and disappointment, but I latched onto his gaze, conveying a silent message that shattered my heart but bolstered my conviction. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I stepped forwards, "I think it's best if I come with you today." Walter scoffed, retorting too quickly, "Oh come on, it's just a checkup. You don't need to coddle him like this." Each syllable felt like barbed wire wrapped around the words, tugging at something primal and repulsive inside me. A scream clawed at the back of my throat, fought tooth and nail against the savagery consuming my rationality. "This isn't just a checkup," I shot back defensively. "It's one of the most significant days he'll have in months. You don't need to be there. You're not his family." My father blinked, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but Walter's reaction was sinister in nature. It turned from shock to thin-lipped anger, a quiet promise of retribution hidden beneath tightly wound lips. The tension crackled in the air like pre-storm electricity, and suddenly, I felt as if every single unwelcome thought I'd buried deep beneath the surface burrowed its way back into prominence, revealing the possibility that Walter could very well be a wolf in sheep's clothing, his concerns surprisingly coordinated with plans I couldn't even fathom. "Fine," Walter said, a smile creeping back onto his face like a spider waiting for its chance to snag its prey, "but you'll see, my support was what he needed after all." As my father slipped on his coat and I ushered him forward, I dared not glance back at Walter, but a cold chill washed over me, an irrational fear gnawing at my insides like rats feasting on the carcass of my worst nightmares. The ride to the hospital was a silent war zone. I searched for the right words to calm my racing heart. My dad nodded, oblivious to my internal struggle, as I feigned casual conversation about the upcoming baseball season, drowning every overture of worry beneath a thin ocean of pleasantries. When we finally arrived, the walls around us seemed to close in with every passing moment, and as we stepped into the sterile waiting room, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Walter was lurking just beyond the proximity of that polished glass entrance. Hours passed slowly, dragging our spirits into the unforgiving jaws of uncertainty, each tick of the clock as menacing as the last. When my father was finally called in for his examination, I was asked to wait, and though I tried to maintain an air of nonchalance, my heart thudded painfully, each beat a reminder of everything I feared. And then, without warning, there he was, Walter, striding into the waiting area, face plastered with a sinister blend of smugness and feigned concern. Good news, huh? He chirped, as if the world shrank around us to conform to his twisted whims. I'll be here for my dear friend no matter what. My stomach churned, wrestling the truth that clawed at me. Walter, you shouldn't be here, I stammered, a fight tangled within me against the absurdity of the interview. Why do you keep coming around? The look that fell across Walter's face was something indescribably dark as he stepped closer. Because someone has to ensure he receives the care he deserves. It would be a shame if something happened to him, by virtue of not having the right people around. The nuance painted in his words dripped with malevolence, the air locked in a state of compression as realization dawned on me. I leapt back, a chill overtaking my skin. You've been sending anonymous messages, haven't you? You've been trying to manipulate him, my accusations hung in the air, feeble but resonating with the truth crashing against my consciousness. Without uttering a word, he leaned closer, and I felt the walls closing in. It was as if my head spun, revelations crashing like glass against stone, the fraying thread of trust unraveling before my very eyes. I fled from him, desperate to reach my father's side, my heart racing, echoing the silent screams spinning in my mind. But by the time I pushed past the nurses to enter the examination room, the words I'd rehearsed had turned to dust on my tongue. My father lay back, a weary smile plastered on his face, and I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he met my gaze. My heart sank. He didn't see the monster lurking just beyond the hospital walls. Instead, it was me, a pariah in the realm of protectiveness. I rushed towards him, wanting nothing more than to mount a defense against the darkness crawling into our lives. Dad, you need to. Just as I began to explain, Walter sauntered into the room, seamlessly sliding into the space like he owned it. You can't live in fear anymore. You have me, I'm your friend and I'm here, he insisted, his tone deceptively calm yet devoid of sincerity. My father blinked, twitching uneasily beneath the pressure of conflicting loyalties, and it felt like hours between breaths. The doctor interrupted us, and relief coiled around my heart like a snake, only for dread to nearly engulf me whole when I left the room to glimpse Walter alone with my father, whispering sweet poison that danced dangerously on the edge of tainted truth. I wrestled with the idea that I needed to pull my father from Walter's grasp. His web was spun tighter than I fathomed. I caught a glimpse of their post-reaction through the frosted glass of the door, Walter's hand resting too nonchalantly atop my father's shoulder. My chest tightened, adrenaline flooding my system, my scream almost escaping my lips when the distant conversation morphed into a grotesque display of betrayal. I burst through the doorway, and as the words tumbled from my mouth, a cacophony of emotions spiraled around me. Leave him alone, I yelled, every ounce of fear pouring into those words. Walter turned, eyes laced with surprise. She's just upset because she knows we're getting closer, he chirped casually, yet the menace dripping from that statement sent goosebumps racing along my skin. My father's expression, perplexed and vulnerable, tugged at my core as he looked between Walter and me. In that instant, I understood the depth of Walter's deception, the slowly curling tendrils of malice wound around my father's already fragile spirit. You don't need him, Dad. You have me. We'll do this together, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of my realization crashing down on me in waves that threatened to encase us both. The doctor stepped in just then, canceling out the tension, and I caught Walter's eyes flicker to something behind me. I turned, electrified, a specter of dread washed over me as I realized he had a plan, something sinister orchestrated within the walls of this sterile fortress. After the appointment concluded, I insisted on finding a new oncologist, my father's indifference echoing hollow against the rising tide of my anguish. It was then that I began hearing whisperings through the townsfolk and family friends, small hints painted over Walter's troubled past, a tapestry entwined with quiet malevolence and ghost stories that left me unsettled. Nightmares haunted my sleep, each encounter with Walter grew more distorted, wrapping itself around my psyche. I couldn't let him invade our lives any longer, but how could I convince my father of the truth? Eventually, my father grew weaker, the cancer took its toll, and all the while Walter gathered around like a vulture, determined to feed off the fragments of my family. One night, after a fraught dinner where Walter's charm barely masked his undertones, I knew I had to expose him, unveil the monster for who he truly was. I called my father to the living room. By now he was frail and pale, and I could see the shadows that tag-teamed with Walter's presence. It felt as though the very air shimmered with an unreadable tension. Dad, I began slowly, we need to talk about Walter. I want to share what I discovered. The moment I uttered his name, the familiar gleam of disapproval glimmered in my father's eyes, and I could see Walter's shadows stretching across the room like dark wings, encircling me in his grasp. "Don't listen to her, old friend," Walter interjected smoothly, "she's just scared of losing you. We all know she tends to exaggerate, don't we?" But my father shook his head, tired but urgent. I could feel his heart battling against the manipulation lurking behind Walter's facade. "You need to understand, he's not what you think he is. He's been lying to you about his intentions." The room stilled, and in that breathless silence, my mind raced. "He's been sending anonymous letters to make it seem like you're worse off than you are. He's trying to take control of the decisions and manipulate you," Walter chuckled, feigning a mockery of restraint. "Sweetheart, isn't it sad how desperately she clings to this idea to keep herself relevant?" But my father narrowed his eyes, a fleeting clarity washing over him. Yet in the wreckage of dissected truth, chaos erupted, and Walter's visage morphed into a furious beast as he lunged towards me, venom dripping from his smile. "You ungrateful little rat. After everything I've done for you, you dare defile my name?" The vulnerability I clung onto began crumbling, and my heart raced as I dove towards my father's side with a growl that reverberated through the walls of our home. This was a battle for survival, a last fight to ensure he wouldn't succumb to the poison oozing from Walter. "Dad, please, you need to believe me," I cried desperately, as Walter's towering presence threatened to engulf us both. I realized then that Walter's grip had taken a form we hadn't yet acknowledged, a resonance of death that fed upon our house like a cancer of its own, and with a flicker of realization, I could feel the shadows pulling at my father's breath, tightening beyond relief. I composed myself, lending everything my heart had against the suffocating wall of Walter, and declared, "If you love him, you'll let him go." Walter's laughter lingered, a cacophony that seemed to bounce off the walls before a sudden silence erupted, and I watched in horror as my father hesitated, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes. The horror spiraled as I made the realization that his only allies were the ghosts of Walter's manipulation, wielding the tenacity of a predator ready to feast. But I refused to back down. I had so much more to say. I needed him to grasp the truth, and it screamed louder than Walter's veiled threats. A moment of poise fell, and when Walter clenched his jaw, I knew that I didn't just seek to save myself but to out anyone who stood even in the periphery of my father's existence. "You may think that you're infallible, but the weight of your lies will bury you." My heart felt like it was shattering, the final pleads vibrating within my own empathy as the walls held their breath, and somewhere deep inside, I felt shivers slither across the threshold. I waited, holding the air, straining for a crack in Walter's facade, searching for the slightest glimpse of vulnerability. "Enough," Walter roared, collapsing into a distorted semblance of rage, his mask peeling away. "You think you can just take him away? He's mine. I thought you had a stronger bond with him. This is how it has always been." With a growing intensity, the air thrummed, the rage pulsed within the room, and as Walter's frustration peaked, it felt like a storm encroaching upon us. If I could just hold on to my father, a newfound strength carving a connection between us, perhaps we could find redemption. The distance and estrangement cloaked the air, but fury ferreted out the truth hidden within. I stepped forward once more, offering my hand to my father, anchoring him against Walter's maelstrom. "Let's leave together," I said softly, my heart desperate against the agony of losing the pivotal relationship to a monster who had no right to claim him. At that moment, an eerie stillness descended, and I witnessed the shifting shadows around us, the fatigue that racked my father's frail body battling against the tendrils snaking from Walter's malevolent smile. "You can't save him from the truth," Walter whispered, "he will always be with me. No more." I thought fiercely, feeling a tide of my voice igniting the calm spaces surrounding us. "No, we can build a future together." The ugly truth revealed as we stepped outside, leaving behind a fragment of itself while welcoming ourselves into the light of new beginnings, the future flickering before us, painstaking yet full of promise. But the last whispers of Walter's proposition wouldn't simply vanish, they lingered behind us like shadows demanding acknowledgement. Weeks passed, during which our home transformed, dwindling specters fading out and acceptance pulling us back into the warmth of family. The truth clocks in, pieces falling into place, as I began helping Dad in ways I feared to lose. But bursts of fear often struck at night. Even though Walter's grip had lessened, the remembrance of what bruised betrayal could do festered as an unease spinning in cycles. It wasn't until one dark, moonless night when nightmares draped themselves around my father and rushed towards the door, a frantic rap echoing against the rich silence. Reading the moment, I approached the door cautiously, the fury of nervous energy surging beneath my skin as the wood groaned beneath my grip. Who could it be? I hesitated, remembering all too clearly the edges that Walter put upon our existence. When I finally opened it, the chill in the air carried the sharp scent of fear. My father blinked, utterly confused, forged in the alleys of worry, and now burdened further by uncertainty. "It's him, isn't it?" I murmured, my heartbeat harmonizing with the echoes surrounding me. "He's coming back for us." The trepidation clouded his expression, and as doubt etched itself deep within my father's brow, I could feel the shadows once more. It felt like the beginning swirling beneath the surface, remnants of a battle unearthed. "You're not going back there," I breathed firmly, feeling the weight of resolution solidifying around us as the seconds dwindled into eternity. Yet Walter wasn't finished. I could feel those eyes probing our defenses, waiting to reclaim the fragments he sought, to wrap them once more within the binding tales of betrayal and tendrils with which he'd strangled our past. A decision rested firmly between us. I steeled my resolve against every ounce of anxiety, fitfully battling against the shadows that might lie ahead. I had freed us once, and I wouldn't surrender with the chains of fear tethered once more. As the door creaked behind me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a stronger bond forged beneath harrowing trials and solidified through every grain of untold sacrifice. I had to convince my father that vulnerability was the foundation of our freedom, that the shadows could only do harm if we allowed them entry. Together, we would endure, for the truth of family burned brighter than the cold encroaching darkness, one which I refused to let win its relentless battle over us. And in that commitment, I felt the darkness encroach upon us, twist into unseen dimensions. Even if Walter tried re-entering our space, I would not let him reclaim the love that remained. I fought for every shred of hope, for every moment that manifested genuine bonds forged through solemnity, warmed by genuine love. It was in that resolve that we pushed back against the darkness, into the light of possibility, the kind that promised liberation from chains that could never be fastened against family, of a future beyond the haunting whispers of Walter's name, long faded yet wordlessly existing, intertwining real ties and those infernal shadows hovering just outside our reach. Last summer, my 6-year-old son Max came rushing into the living room, frame brimming with the triumphant energy only a child committed to an idea can muster, announcing he'd decided to get a pet snake, a decision I met with equal parts dread and challenge. Rewind a week, and I had let him watch a documentary about reptiles, telling him all the wonderful things about them, how they're silent, mysterious, and perfectly contained. It seemed harmless at the time until Max's fixation intensified, drowning out everything else until it became a daily ritual. He'd research snakes for hours, holding on to facts about their eating habits and habitat. Their sinister, hypnotic movements made him dream of becoming a snake whisperer. I was the one holding the reins on reality. Snakes create nightmares, don't they? We live in a suburb spattered with kids, and most of them had puppies and kittens. I couldn't imagine the looks I'd get from the other parents if they sporadically encountered my boy frolicking with a long, scaled creature in the yard, or worse, if it escaped into the neighborhood. Thus, I decided to inject some realism into this fantasy. I called a local reptile rescue and arranged a visit. The day arrived, easing my nervousness as I drove to the small facility where scaly creatures sat in enclosure after enclosure, murmuring secrets of the wild. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread, half expecting a Houdini snake to leap from its cage and fly for freedom. But upon entering, Max's eyes reflected nothing but awe. He glided from tank to tank, glued to the glass, scarcely breathing, while I stood off to the side, dread building like a storm cloud. Then it happened. He spotted a black mamba. The staff warned us, they weren't kidding, and it was terrifyingly beautiful, its sleek body glistening in the fluorescent light, an almost hypnotizing sight as it flickered its tongue in and out, tasting the air. One of the workers, noting Max's fascination, leaned in with a guarded seriousness. "You know, they are deadly, right?" I could sense Max's excitement inching toward horror, but instead of pulling him away, I decided to reinforce reality. "See, Max? This is what I mean about snakes. They can seem mesmerizing, but they're also dangerous. No one should have one in the house unless they really know what they're doing." His sparkle dimmed, brows knitted together in confusion and disappointment. "So we can't have one, Dad?" My heart seared at the thought, and unable to meet his determined gaze, I replied, "Absolutely not. Just then, he turned on his heel, storming out of the room, the pent-up resolve of a child shattered with a single blow, and I thought maybe I had overdone it, but I nursed the belief that I did it for his safety, though a creeping guilt began to take root. We arrived home, and the atmosphere shifted, the air felt static, and I saw Max's face harden into a stubborn expression that told me this wasn't over yet. Days turned into a battlefield of tears and tantrums, him pleading for even a small, harmless snake, swearing he would care for it himself if I'd just let it happen. "Don't you trust me?" he'd yell, and my heart splintered as I struggled against an invisible wall growing ever higher. Then came the day that broke me. I remember barely holding together my nerves when Max burst into the kitchen wielding a crumpled sheet of paper he'd drawn upon. "This is me," he shouted, presenting a crude, bright crayon drawing that depicted him with a snake coiling around his tiny waist, a face devoid of fear, its smile matching his own. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just art, it was his way of coping, of becoming the snake charmer he thought he could be, and suddenly, in the moment of false triumph, the room felt too small. My breath caught as I realized how desperately he wanted to connect, turning a simple pet into a bridge to something bigger. "Mom and I have talked about it. Just trust me, Dad, I'll be gentle," he insisted, but I was rigid, turning his innocent plea into a fortress of rejection. "Max, it doesn't matter. I won't let you get hurt," I snapped, and there it was, the crushing realization hit me. In protecting him, I was breaking him, and the tears rolled down his cheeks, the paper falling like a forgotten dream as he staggered back. It rumbled, guilt rolled in waves through my head as I saw him flee, a small silhouette against bright walls, and seconds later, I heard the door slam behind him. I found him curled up in the corner of his room, sobbing softly into his pillow, and at that moment, every rationalization melted away. I wanted to apologize but felt locked in, trapped by my decision and the fear of looming judgment from everyone around me, including myself. We are parents, aren't we? We bear the weight of our children's pain and dreams, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I went to give him a hug, but he recoiled, wiped his face angrily, and spat, "Just leave me alone. You don't care about me." Over the next few days, that wretched guilt clung to me like a shadow, pushing my thoughts into darker corners. I tried to engage him in other activities, to erase the memory of that day, but he wouldn't have it. He'd draw more pictures, always involving the same snake, and I'd push it down, push it aside. Until one evening, while sorting through the junk, I stumbled across my college roommate's journal filled with ramblings about folklore and mysticism surrounding animals thought possessed by spirits. I got lost in dark avenues and old stories and discovered something I hadn't thought of in years, a legend about snakes and the children that could speak to them as if they shared a bond of telepathy. My heart raced as I wrestled with thoughts, and that night I couldn't sleep. I dreamt, or rather, I was haunted by Max, and in my dream, he stood with a snake wrapped around his body, looking at me with those big, watery eyes. "Dad, you let it take me," he said, his voice a fragile echo reverberating through the unmistakable serpentine coil. I woke with a start, panting and drenched in horror, an involuntary promise forming on my lips that I would fix this. I needed to make amends before it settled into something irreparable. I knew then that I had to find a way to show Max I believed in him. I mustered every ounce of will and landed on an idea. After all, he wouldn't let the snake slip from his soul, and I had no choice but to let him learn. So, weeks later, with trembling hands and a racing heart, I returned to that facility, but this time apprehensive hope guided my steps. I explained to the same employee about my son's growth, his unwavering passion, and an idea sparked. "Maybe you can help teach him," I ventured, "so that I can see him grow without fear." And I swear, the generous smile from the employee felt like a key. Maybe this wouldn't destroy my child but nurture a fierce respect instead. That weekend, I set everything up, asking Max to join me at the facility to unveil my decision. When I saw him, the wall of anger dissipated, and I whispered, "I found out we're getting you lessons with a trainer," and for a moment, pure astonishment lit up his face. The floodgates burst open as he threw his arms around me, sobbing with gratitude, releasing so much pent-up tension and fear. It felt like heavy weights slipping off my chest, and for the first time, we were back to where we belonged, but then came the creaking feeling of dread. A small, yet haunting voice within reminded me of how close it had come to breaking, and as Max reported how excited he was to learn proper handling, I imagined how close we'd been to losing everything. In the weeks that followed, I often observed Max in the lessons, seeing him step into an understanding that wasn't dictated by fear but by love and respect for the creatures that might seem unimaginable to parents like me. Yet, unease lurked in the air, that gnawing feeling grew as though the snake knew secrets we weren't privy to, and one night as I tucked Max into bed, I caught a glimpse of his crayon drawing sitting atop the bedside table, the snake at its center, smiling, almost sentient as if it held power over our world. A chill coiled around my spine as if it was vital to something far greater than us, and as I left his room, I couldn't help but wonder if there was truth behind the idea that some bonds, like love for those serpents, could also hold dangerous potential. I never thought refusing to give candy to my neighbor's kids could spiral into something so terrifying, but that's how the nightmare began. It started innocently enough. It was Halloween, and like every year, I had stocked up on the usual assortment of sweets, but this time, I was adamant about not giving any to the children who lived next door. You see, that family had moved in just a few months prior, and their kids, 2 boys named Jake and Sam, were anything but normal. Sure, at first glance, they seemed like regular kids, dressed up as superheroes and goblins just like everyone else, but there was always something off about their laughter. It echoed too loudly, cutting through the comforting air of the evening like a serrated knife, and their smiles stretched a little too wide, revealing too much of their teeth. When they came to my door that evening, I felt the dread knotting in my stomach as I looked down at their expectant faces, makeup smeared and gleaming like freshly spilled blood under the streetlight. I simply shook my head, muttered a polite sorry, and closed the door quickly, heart racing because as soon as I did, they stepped back and their expressions morphed from disappointment to something almost predatory. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting them to turn away, but instead, I could hear whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, conversations swaying and twisting in the air until it felt like even the walls were sharpening their ears, and then, with a slight click, I saw the doorknob turn, my heart dropping into my stomach. I rushed to check the locks, my breath hitching, and when I glanced back at the door, their faces were close against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated like black holes ready to swallow me whole. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. Later that night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to drown out the relentlessness of their sadistic giggles echoing through the dark. At midnight, I heard a sudden thud against the side of the house, my heart leapt, panic clawing at my throat, and I peeked out from the window. They stood there, cloaked in shadows, still wearing their costumes, but something else flickered in their eyes, a mischief so sinister it sent tremors sparking through my veins. I decided to call the police, dialing with shaking fingers, and as I whispered my fears into the phone, the operator's voice faded into a distant stream of incoherence while I watched through the blinds as the children began to move away, stage whispering to each other, as if plotting something insidious, their brazen confidence fueling a dark weight of inevitability in my stomach. I hung up the phone, listening for sirens that never came while I recalled every warning my mother had given me about children who looked too perfect, acting too strange, those warnings blurring with the image of their wide, gleaming smiles piercing through the night air. As the hours edged closer to dawn, the atmosphere thickened, like fog curling around my ankles, whispers suddenly morphing into faint, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the silence of my home. I thought of calling out, confronting them, telling them to go home, to leave me alone, but the tightly wound ball of fear kept me glued to my spot. Instead, I wandered through my house, turning on every light like a moth drawn to reassurance, the manic laughter substituting for the innocence of children's games. It wasn't until I heard a light knock at my back door that I felt the color drain from my face. I stayed silent, hoping it was a trick of the wind, but then again came the knock, this time sharp and insistent. I decided I couldn't ignore them any longer. My curiosity had grown too vast, pulling me forward toward the back door. I cracked it open just a fraction, and I saw them, the 2 boys standing there, their costumes barely illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. But they weren't just looking for candy anymore. Their faces were now almost nurturing, almost saccharine, and they spoke in murmurs that had no relation to the holiday anymore. "Aren't you lonely?" they asked, and the words slithered into my mind like venom, splitting open the dark corners that had learned to fear the silence. For a moment, I thought about inviting them in just to make the madness stop, to tame the swirling chaos they stirred within me, but I held my ground, glaring at their childish facade, desperate for any semblance of caution that might assert that I wasn't losing my mind so soon. "We don't bite," Sam said with a grin that seemed too sharp, 2 tiny daggers glimmering in the faint light. I slammed the door shut and without thinking, turned the lock, breath trembling as I stumbled back into my hallway, desperate to gather my thoughts. The night dragged on in a vicious cycle of laughter, knocks, and whispers, each sound doubling down on the anxiety pounding in my chest when suddenly, I heard it, my phone vibrating on the table. I could have sworn it was the police, patrolling the area after my call. As I looked at the screen, my heart dropped. It was a text from my neighbor, the boy's mother. It read, "There's something wrong with my boys. Don't let them in. We'll take care of it." My mind blanked in that moment, and then came the realization that I had no idea what was in those boys, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize, it wasn't just them. It was something divine and grotesque, a darkness like tar creeping between the walls of this quiet house, and when the electricity flickered, illuminating their faces for a split second, hands pressed against the glass, breath fogging up the pain, I knew I was stuck, lost in the entropy of my choices. Their forms pulsed in the light, eventually blending back into darkness as if they were merely shadows stitched from the fabric of fear, and then came a crashing sound, something like wood splintering against a brick wall. My breath stilled, my heart thudding against my ribcage, and I ran to the window in time to see a figure darting from my yard, but I couldn't see who it was. Was it the boys or someone else, something else? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The night blurred past, a cacophony of terror against my ears, the boys receding back into their home, laughter fading until I could hear the heavy insistence of my own heartbeat and my breath. And before the dawn swept in, I made a decision, I would confront them. But when morning arrived, the shadows dispersed, and a calm fell across the neighborhood. The boys were gone, their family vanished without a trace. I knocked on the door of the house next door, rapping my knuckles against the splintering wood, and when it swung open, a stranger stared back at me, a woman with sunken eyes and the coldness of a grave wrapped around her silence. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, and I felt the winds shift around me. When I described the family, expecting a semblance of recognition, her gaze darkened. "I've lived here for years," she said slowly. "No children have ever lived next door." And just like that, the reality of the boys haunted me like a ghost, those monstrous smiles slicing through my sanity, echoing a question that repeated with no answer, "AITA for not giving the neighbor's kids candy?" The words now strung like a noose around my mind, tightening it into terror. And as I stumbled back into my own home, the lights flickering ominously above me, I realized that perhaps in refusing to give candy, I had given them something much worse, my fear, the key to a darkness that would never leave me. When I first met Aaron, his odd habit of sitting on the stairs struck me as endearing, a quirk that added charm to his otherwise grounded personality, but after 3 years of marriage, what I initially found whimsical became a chilling source of contention. Every evening like clockwork, perched against the staircase railing, he would sit staring into the shadows cast by the dim hallway light as if waiting for something, or someone. At first, I shrugged it off as a simple idiosyncrasy, we all have our routines, right? Yet, the deeper I delved into his unyielding descent into this strange fixation, the more I realized I was slipping down the rabbit hole with him. Friends raised eyebrows during dinner parties when Aaron spontaneously excused himself for stare time, and I found myself defending him when they laughed and made comments like, "Is he trying to catch ghosts?" My own laughter had faltered awkwardly, but dismissing the behavior outright felt wrong. In my heart, I could feel something lurking in the back of my mind, that unsettling chill that crawled down my spine, whispering that something wasn't right. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I first started questioning his fixation as more than just harmless silliness. The lightning struck so close that the glass in our windows rattled, and the power flickered, plunging us into darkness. I stumbled to find my flashlight, but as I neared the staircase, a strange sound drifted from Aaron's post, a low, hypnotic hum, flowing like water over stones. My heart raced as I shone the beam toward him, but he appeared blissfully ignorant of my presence, completely entranced. Just then, the hum morphed into words, taunting me, whispering my name with an unsettling familiarity that sent ice through my veins. I wanted to reach for him, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but my feet felt glued to the floor, unwilling to break the spell. "Aaron?" I finally squeaked. He blinked, his gaze coming into focus, and the look of pure confusion on his face was like a shard of glass slicing through my chest. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. After stumbling over my words, I told him about the humming, but he shrugged it off as a trick of the storm. The next day, I decided to do some digging, researching stairs sitting online, and my stomach fell. It was a bizarre phenomenon some called positional meditation, with connections to cult-like practices, which began painting a sinister picture in my mind. I thought of confronting him but was paralyzed by fear. What if the quiet surrender to the shadows was a sign of something darker, a part of him I didn't know? Days turned into weeks, and the frequency of his stare-sitting escalated. Sometimes I could hear him murmuring, having conversations in a language I didn't recognize, while I became a ghost in our own home, hovering in the kitchens and bedrooms filled with toxic dread. One evening, desperation got the best of me, and I staked out in the hallway to confront him. I leaned against the wall, heart pounding, when I finally summoned the courage and confronted him, demanding he quit the odd ritual. But when I reached out, suddenly my world disintegrated as the air crackled around us. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his eyes wide with something I had never seen before, fear mixed with exhilaration. "They are waiting for me. The sound calls." I felt ice twisting in my stomach. There it was, the singular rift between us, with me standing firmly on one side, desperately trying to pull him back from whatever abyss he tumbled into. Panic washed over me, and I insisted we needed help, but Aaron only tightened his grip on the banister, eyes glistening as though he were torn, an entire universe breaking apart behind them. That was when the strange noises began. Every night after he started spiraling, the walls creaked and groaned, shadows flickered just out of view, like they were sneering at our fragile existence. I debated whether I should call someone or wake him, but then I hesitated and drowned in silence. I spent sleepless nights on the couch, terrified to wander near the stairs lest I catch a glimpse of whatever ethereal thing had captivated him. Then one night, just when I thought I could accept our new distorted reality, I awoke to find Aaron standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the blackness, taking on an almost ghostly posture, unblinkingly fixated on the top step, where a pale, flickering light began to materialize. My voice croaked as I called out, demanding to know what he could see, but he merely responded, "They're here now, they've come for me." Time shattered. I felt my heart racing and an overwhelming urge to flee. The very shadows that had once draped our home now felt like living entities, swirling and beckoning. In a moment of extreme desperation and instinct, I lunged and grabbed him, pulling him away from the bottom step, terrified of the fate he was so eagerly embracing. The light winked out with a pop, and he turned to me, rage and confusion flaring in his eyes before something in them dimmed, and he finally seemed to break free from whatever enchantment had gripped him. "What did you do?" he murmured, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. I took a step back, horrified yet relieved, realizing I had yanked him back from some tongue-in-cheek path that offered nothing but despair. We spent that night talking. I tried explaining the sounds, the way he'd been acting, the horror clawing through my mind. He listened, nodding slowly, but it felt like trying to stitch a gaping wound closed with nothing but threads of silence. He promised to stop sitting on the stairs, but the truth was, he didn't. He just did it when I wasn't home, and what was even worse? It didn't seem to bother him, a secret pathway he had invisibly carved for himself. The creaking of the stairs became my worst nightmare, a haunting reminder that something darker was tangled in the very fabric of our lives, gnawing at the edges of our reality. A few weeks later, I received a message from a friend who had seen a post on a local forum. It was about stair-sitting, but this time the tone shifted towards something darker. Someone related their own experience, detailing people who had disappeared after embracing the dark rituals surrounding stair-sitting. My heart crumpled as I understood too well that each tale resonated painfully with our own. I couldn't bear to think that Aaron was edging toward that fate, and that's when I realized it was no longer a simple quirk, it was a siren call to his very essence. One night, I confronted him yet again, my voice trembling as I pleaded for him to talk to me, to let me help him break free from this malevolent pull. He grew distant, his eyes glazing over as he muttered about how the connection was irreplaceable, his lips curling into a smile that made my skin crawl. In the pit of my stomach, I felt doom approaching. The shadows were gathering once again, a thick black fog creeping closer, and I didn't know if I could save him before it was too late. Things escalated into madness. Every time I caught him sitting, whispers would crawl through the house like a sinister echo, and I grew more frantic. I searched for solutions, scoured the web for anything that might help. Most advice seemed like a vague, foggy guide that only intensified the fear of my helplessness, but I stumbled upon a last resort suggestion, a ritual to confront what he now called the calling. I knew it could just as easily backfire, but if it meant saving him, I had to try. The night of the ritual came, and our home pulsed with an ominous energy as I set everything up, the air thick as I placed candles around us, trembling as I prepared to expose the heart of the problem once and for all. I asked him to sit on the stairs, to summon whatever dark force had wrapped itself around him, and for a moment, it appeared as if he was being pulled back into that strange trance as I followed behind, holding tightly to the love I had for him like a shield. When he closed his eyes and the shadows swirled, I could hear the faint sound of whispering, drawing us both in, and my mind was racing as I fought against the tangible hold they had on him. I felt like I was losing him all over again, but I pushed through. I cried out, begging for him to focus on me. Don't you see? They want you, but you're more than this. The energy shifted, rippling through the air, and I prayed for clarity, for him to break free from whatever malevolent grip was pulling him. For an agonizing moment, it looked as if he might not return, that the shadows would swallow him whole, but in a rush of courage, I wrapped my arms around his waist. It was a surge of feral determination that pulled him back to me, and he jolted awake, gasping as the dark whispers faded into silence. We fell back onto the floor, panting heavily. I won't let you go, I cried, holding him tightly, as though I could sew his very essence back together. I thought we would be safe now, that the dark merely needed to be confronted, but a sudden realization crashed over me like thunder. Aaron's grin had shifted from a mere twisted amusement to something far more sinister. He whispered into my ear, "They're still here." The air turned cold, and even as I felt hope bloom in my chest, the shadows flickered back to life, thickening around us, absorbing my disbelief as they reached for my husband, my love, threatening to unravel every shred of light I still harbored. Now as I sit here, heart racing and hands trembling, I can't help but wonder if in my desperate attempts to save him, in defending against that haunting ritual, I've only placed myself within reach of the darkness too. AITA for defending my husband's stair-sitting habits? I think I already know the answer, and I'm terrified of what it may mean for the both of us. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I'd have to confront my boyfriend's aunt over a Coachella ticket, but here I am, sitting on this dingy couch, heart racing as the realization of what just transpired washes over me like a tidal wave. It all started innocently enough. My boyfriend, Jake, had promised me a magical weekend filled with music, friends, and memories after saving up for months to attend the festival, and when I casually mentioned that I'd be bringing my best friend Sarah along too, Jake's excitement turned into something else entirely. He had a pretty big family, and while I loved spending time with them, his Aunt Linda was a piece of work, horribly intrusive and always looking for ways to reap the benefits of being part of the family. So when she sidled up to me at dinner last week, flashing her overly bright smile and the glimmer of something sinister in her eyes, I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Oh, sweetie, how nice for you to go to Coachella. I'd love to see what all the fuss is about," she cooed, her voice dripped with mock sincerity. I didn't think much of it at first, but that Saturday morning when I reached for my ticket to send to Sarah, my stomach dropped. It was gone. I frantically searched every corner of my room, thinking I'd simply misplaced it, but deep down, I knew. I could feel her eyes watching me during dinner, lingering a little longer when she asked, and I gleefully explained how I'd managed to snag a ticket against the odds. It felt awful admitting it to Jake, but he was just as angry as I was. He assured me we'd confront her together. So, the following Sunday, after pacing back and forth, rehearsing a dozen ways to address the theft, we finally knocked on her door. I mean, I never wanted to escalate the situation, but when she opened the door in her threadbare pajamas, looking more disheveled than usual, and when I said, "Aunt Linda, we need to talk about the ticket," her expression shifted from surprise to amusement, and then to smugness, like she held all the cards in this game that I barely understood. "Oh sweetheart, did you really think you'd get away with that? A Coachella ticket? You should have known I'd take it. It's nothing personal, it's just business," she said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather. An icy pit formed in my stomach as the earlier thrill of my impending trip dissipated into sheer disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're stealing from your own family." "That's messed up," I managed to choke out, but she waved her hand dismissively, her laughter echoing in that cramped entryway. That's when I snapped, "I could call the cops on you, Linda. Stealing a ticket is still a crime," I spat, regretting my harsh tone a moment later, but the truth hung in the air, and I could tell it hit her harder than I expected. The lightheartedness faded as something darker tightened around her eyes, and for a brief moment, it felt as if shadows shifted within her soul, revealing fractured intentions. "You really want to take this higher?" she asked, amusement gone, replaced by a low, chill-inducing whisper. My palms became clammy. I hadn't actually wanted to threaten her or anything, but there was something twisted about the way she responded, like she was unbothered and yet simmering beneath the surface. Without waiting for my reply, she slammed the door shut, leaving Jake and me standing there in utter disbelief. The drive home was numbingly silent, but the tension hung between us like a potential storm on the horizon. A week passed and our Coachella dreams began to fade into bitter memories, and that's when I received a text: "I hope you're ready for me to spoil your weekend." I felt a wave of anger mixed with dread as I read the message again. Who the hell did she think she was? Jake urged me to let it go, saying it wasn't worth the trouble, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Aunt Linda was more than just a quirky family member with questionable morals. The night before we were set to leave, I couldn't sleep. The thought of stepping into a festival atmosphere while knowing she might be lurking around transformed my excitement into anxiety. I smashed my phone down when another notification lit up, followed by a loud, menacing snicker cascading from the darkness outside my window. A memory flickered to life, the way that Linda gazed at me, almost as if she enjoyed my discomfort. That very night, Sarah, who had driven in from out of town, texted that she was running late due to roadwork, and in no time, Jake and I were ready to go, practically bouncing off the walls despite the aura of dread contradicting our enthusiasm. The sun beat down mercilessly as we drove to the venue, the vibe electric with anticipation, yet I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Glancing around, jitters coursed through me until we finally parked and made our way through the crowd, the bass vibrating beneath our feet, the air thick with the sweet aroma of festival food and excitement. Music filled the air as we found our place among friends, but as the first band took the stage, I felt someone watching me from the edge of the crowd. My heart raced as I turned. There, mingling with festival goers, was Aunt Linda, looking as innocent as ever, rocking her signature flower crown. Panic clouded my mind. Did she come to ruin my experience, or was it some twisted intervention? I nudged Jake and pointed. "What the hell is she doing here?" He turned sharply. "Give it a rest, she's probably just enjoying herself," but I wasn't convinced. I spent the next few sets watching her from afar, and the longer I stared, the more she appeared to embody this harbinger of chaos, weaving through groups of people and then disappearing into the crowd. It was only during the third set that everything escalated. Sarah and I were dancing, lost in the rhythms, but suddenly I felt a hand grab my shoulder, yanking me back. I spun around, ready for a confrontation, when I came face to face with Linda, her eyes glinting with something dark, her mouth twisted in a strange smile. "You didn't think you'd get here unscathed, did you?" She sneered, her voice a sickly sweet whisper. My stomach dropped as Jake rushed to my side, anger flaring in his chest, but before he could say anything, she leaned in closer, her breath cold against my ear and said, "You should have kept your mouth shut, honey, you have no idea who you're dealing with. This is my playground." Then she slipped into the crowd, leaving us stunned, my heart racing in my chest. I felt sick. Who was this woman that she turned a simple estrangement into something so sinister? I wanted to enjoy this festival more than anything, but the gnawing sense of danger lingered like a shadow, overshadowing even the brightest moments. The night stretched on, and hours passed, filled with intoxicating music and laughter tinged with anxiety until finally, just when I thought I could breathe easy again, I turned and spotted Linda once more, lurking, but this time she was speaking to a group of security guards. Fear coursed through me. There was no doubt in my mind this woman was plotting something malicious. Within moments, murmurs began spreading through the crowd, and then chaos erupted. Someone had punched one of the security guards, and as bodies began to flee, I saw Jake look toward me, panic etched across his face. "We have to go now," he yelled, and we made a run for it along with hundreds of others, the bliss of the festival engulfed by sheer terror. I glanced back and saw Linda, somehow reveling in the pandemonium she'd unleashed, and it hit me, the ticket, the threat, the laughter, they'd all been part of some twisted game she played, and now I was a player in her insane reality. As we slipped past the barriers and swarmed into the parking lot, the echoes of sirens neared with each step. "Where did she go?" I gasped, searching the crowd, but my entire body screamed that this wasn't over. We piled into the car, and although Jake fumbled with keys, I stared into the chaos we'd just escaped. "Aunt Linda's insane," I breathed. He nodded, eyes fixed on the growing crowd around us. Just when we thought we'd slipped away, my phone buzzed again with a text, "You can't escape me. I'll find you, sweetheart." That night, every ounce of excitement was completely drained from me, and as we sat parked outside our apartment, I realized this Coachella trip had turned into a nightmare filled with threats woven into memories, and Aunt Linda was only the beginning. I never thought I'd say this, but I might actually have to call the cops. When I suggested to my friend Jenna that maybe she shouldn't have chosen her sperm donor based on just one photo and a clever description, I never expected it would escalate to the chaotic whirlpool of dread that engulfed both our lives. Jenna had always been the dreamer in our friendship. While I was practical and often skeptical, she floated through life with optimism, determined to become a mother without a partner. I celebrated her resolve, but when she finally went through with the insemination after poring over the profiles of anonymous donors, I felt a chill in my spine as if I could already sense the impending disaster lurking in her choice. It all seemed wonderful at first, her joyous announcement, the joyous chatter of our group, her glowing features as she cradled her burgeoning belly. But the euphoric bliss quickly shifted when Jenna began receiving strange messages on her social media from an account with no profile picture, the tone gradually shifting from benign curiosity into unsettling comments regarding her pregnancy. I urged her to report the user and shut it all down, but Jenna was convinced they were just a passionate fan, someone intrigued by her and her journey into motherhood. I could only look on with mounting uneasiness, whispering silent prayers that my gut instinct was wrong. As weeks dragged on, the messages took a darker turn, each one painted with the brushstrokes of obsession, fragments of personal details only someone from her life could know, revealing they were more than just a faceless stranger behind a screen. Jenna laughed it off, but her eyes flickered doubt the night she received a photo, a grainy image of herself, taken from the street as she had walked home alone after work. My heart raced. I knew I couldn't remain passive anymore, so I insisted we dig deeper. The more we searched, the more horrifying the discovery became. It turned out her donor had a history of erratic behavior, one too close for comfort to criminal activities that were chilling in nature. He was a ghost of his past, still linked to a chilling personal philosophy that revolved around obsessive control and dominance. I confronted her with everything we had found, the fortune of research and our lies like poetry turned tragic, but instead of finding understanding, Jenna's face twisted in betrayal as she spat her anger at me for making her second-guess her dreams. Hurt rained down on our friendship like an avalanche. She stormed out, leaving me to grapple with the suffocating notion that I might have crossed a line, yet deep down, I knew that her unborn child, my potential godchild, was at stake. A week passed without contact until one dreary Tuesday evening, as rain lashed against the windows, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna. "I need you right now," it said, echoing with heaviness that pulled me from my chair to her door. What I found when I arrived was a realm of horror. Her apartment was plunged into darkness, the living room, curtains drawn as though to shun all light, carrying a musky odor of fear and anxiety. "I can't trust anyone," she whispered, holding her phone as if it were a lighthouse guiding her way through a storm. I felt my pulse quicken as she explained how she had begun hearing footsteps trailing her at work, the sensation of someone watching her every move, the whispering of dark secrets in passing conversations, heightening her paranoia like weeds consuming a garden. I took her hand, holding on as tightly as I could as I assured her this had to end. I vowed to help her confront whatever demons were lurking in the shadows, never once imagining the true monster we were about to unearth. That night, we couldn't sleep. We swapped theories, dissecting every lead that had felt like a thread coming unraveled. After hours of fear-filled chatter, we decided to confront the sperm bank, hoping for answers tied to the donor's identity that could sever the invisible tether weaving into our lives. Little did we know our innocent intentions unspooled into a web of horror. When we reached the office, the receptionist's glazed look was extraordinary, her voice hollow as if rehearsed. She finally handed us the consent forms, revealing a nonchalant warning that there was another use for the donor's genetic material aside from standard insemination, a program that allowed embryos to be artificially implanted in a laboratory under certain conditions. I was nauseated, unable to reconcile how something that should have brought life could lead us down this harrowing rabbit hole. Jenna's eyes widened with dread as we began connecting the dots, realizing the sleepless nights terrified by an unseen hand were merely a prelude to something more sinister. I felt a sudden tingling at the back of my mind, a wild realization. Jenna's donor wasn't just searching for potential children, he had created his own family of twisted fantasies, feeding off the lives entwined in his web like a spider waiting. That night, Jenna was up all night panting, emotionally shattered as the uncertainty of her situation spiraled. As dawn broke, I vowed that we would no longer remain silent. Together, we started piecing together the breadcrumbs of horrible truth, approaching police who, at first, brushed us off as paranoia, but with sheer determination, we persuaded them to launch an investigation into the donor's unsettling past. The story exploded in agonizing detail. The whispers of hacked accounts, stalking, obsessive rages came to light. But what truly shattered us was the realization that he had indeed been weaving his threads into Jenna's life. As I stood by her that morning in the police station, two shadows of raw fear intertwined, I couldn't shake the reminder that this was all a consequence of a single choice, a single photo, the life-changing decision of picking a sperm donor. The aftershocks of that moment still reverberate in our lives, and as she holds her child now, I can't help but wonder, AITA for trying to help my friend? I wish I could say that love conquers all, but sometimes the darkness finds a way, lurking in the periphery of our naive dreams, waiting to pounce. Last month, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of chaos that turned my quiet suburban life upside down, all because of my near-adult son's gluten intolerance, which frankly seemed to surface just as he was nearing 18, insisting on gluten-free meals while treating me like the villain for refusing to cater to his whims. It all started innocently enough when I was rummaging through a dusty box of old family recipe cards, hoping to rediscover the love I once had for cooking, but the sound of my son's voice interrupted my daydreams of homemade pasta, the way he breathlessly announced his new dietary demands as if he had just won the lottery, and my heart sank, thinking of the ravaged gluten-filled meals we shared, the memories now tainted by his self-imposed culinary prison. I told him that cooking had always been a joy for me, but now it felt like I was being shackled with chains with every new gluten-free request, and yet there was something deeper I noticed in his eyes. A kind of desperation that struck me as odd, as if this was less about the food and more about something he wasn't telling me. But when I asked him why all of a sudden gluten was the enemy, he merely shrugged, muttering roughly about feeling better since spring started, and looking for a sense of control in a world that was rapidly falling apart around him. Still, no matter how many times I attempted to reason with him, he insisted on staying gluten-free, refusing any family meals I prepared unless they fit his strict parameters, which left me feeling like I was losing my grip on him. What's worse, he had a penchant for dragging me into his world of restrictive eating, and soon I was spending sleepless nights scrolling gluten-free recipes that felt more like torture than genuine interest. The thought of denying him any kind of dinner out together gnawed at my conscience, yet I was firm in my belief that he was simply going through a phase, the phase of teenage rebellion taken too far. And when he turned the heat up, I finally knew I had to put my foot down, refusing to take him out for meals, holding on to the hope that someday he'd break free of this ridiculous gluten-free fad and return to the son I once knew. My refusal only escalated tensions in our home, with every shared meal now threatening to collapse into an argument, and that's when things began to shift. I noticed something strange about the food I had started preparing. Dishes that had once been a source of comfort now felt tainted, an ominous shadow creeping into my kitchen. The taste of my chicken soup became metallic. Nothing matched up with memories of laughter and family gatherings around the table, as I shivered with the knowledge that something darker lurked within my own walls. Then, one evening while cleaning the basement, I stumbled upon an old recipe hidden beneath a pile of dust, scrawled in my late grandmother's handwriting, speaking of a healing herb, warning of its powers and how it could twist the body in response to the words sent out, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping dread that the reason for my son's sudden gluten intolerance wasn't a passing fad but something rooted in generations of our family, lingering remnants of old-world knowledge entwined with strange and twisted practices that we inherited without question, as if the very act of cooking was a ritual now twisted in ways we never understood. Inevitable outcomes loomed closer with each meal I prepared, twisting the knife further, the moment I faced him again over dinner after unearthing it, trying to mask my concern behind a veneer of normalcy. I watched as he devoured the food, his face twisting with each bite, making me question my own choices. The walls around us seemed to breathe as I asked if he liked the meal, praying for a different answer, when suddenly, everything fell silent. The fork slipped from his fingers, crashing against the plate as he doubled over. The horror on his face resonated with heartbreak. And I finally realized how the tables had turned. This wasn't just a diet where he could choose what to eat. It was metaphorically chaining his essence, his very being, transforming him into something I could barely recognize. Was it the food, the recipes, or something else entirely that sparked feelings of dread? Fat panic rising in my throat as he gasped, pleading with red-rimmed eyes for some semblance of gluten just to make it stop. Each breath he gasped fully paralyzing me into place as fear coursed through me and, in one moment of despair, I understood. I no longer had the power to create meals that nurtured and healed, but ones that hurt and betrayed. The panic only heightened when I realized time was running out, and my only option was to regain some semblance of control, but that control had slipped through my fingers, out of reach, like grains of gluten he no longer seemed able to stomach. I raced back to the basement, frantically flipping through those weathered recipe cards in search for the herb, hoping against hope that maybe I could salvage something from this mess before it consumed us both, when all the while, I couldn't shake the horrifying thought that I might just be the monster feeding the curse, forced to come to terms with a truth I wasn't prepared to face, that the answer to our demise might have been hidden down in dark corners far deeper than either of us could have ever imagined. AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation? It started as a simple family trip to a cabin in the woods, a chance for my kids to unwind before school started again, but everything changed when my sister's son, Jamie, was mentioned. I hadn't seen him in a while. His mother, Sarah, had become reclusive since her divorce, her walls tightening around her like a fortress. The last time we were together, Jamie was a sweet, albeit awkward, 12-year-old. You'd think his 16th birthday would have matured him, but he felt different somehow, more distant and brooding. Sarah texted me a week before we left, pleading me to take him. He needs family, she wrote, her words laced with desperation. I hesitated. Jamie had started to linger around the edges of social media, posting pictures that hinted at a fascination with dark themes, and I've always been the protective type, especially when it concerns my kids. Just days before the trip, I finally responded, "He can stay with you, we're looking for a low-key vacation." I thought that would be the end of it. But on the day we left, I caught my sister's expression when she saw my kids loaded into the car, a mix of hope and dread that twisted something inside me. They waved goodbye, and Jamie's eyes, oh God, those eyes, held such a haunting intensity, a storm of emotions boiling just beneath the surface. I could barely sleep in the cabin, the walls creaked unnervingly at night, and I kept hearing whispers, low and slithering like a snake through the air, but I tried to shake it off, just the house settling, I told myself. On the second evening, while the kids roasted marshmallows outside, I found an old scrapbook tucked beneath one of the beds in our room. The pages were yellowed and curling, filled with grainy photographs of children. I flipped through and my stomach dropped at the sight. Jamie was in some of them, looking eerily out of place, and the other kids, they looked off, like something dark was seeping from their smiles, their eyes too hollow. My headache worsened, shadows seemed to twist into figures in the periphery, and I could have sworn I heard breathing whenever I turned my back. I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had known something before she packed Jamie off. That night, my children were restless, they tossed and turned, sleep eluding them, and at one point, my youngest, Lily, woke me up, wide-eyed and terrified, whispering of a man in the woods who stared at her from behind the trees. I brushed it off, thinking it was just an imagination lit by the flickering firelight, but I couldn't help but feel an ominous presence lurking beyond our campfire. The following day, I decided to take a hike with the kids to dispel the uneasy feeling hanging over us. As we wandered deeper into the woods, I noticed a tree carved with strange symbols, things that twisted my stomach and made my heart race, symbols that hinted at something ritualistic, dark. Lily, transfixed, wanted to touch the bark, but I pulled her away just in time, the feeling of dread coiling tighter around my mind. That evening, the message came through. Sarah was frantic, texting me nonstop, telling me Jamie had gone missing. My heart dropped, panic crashing over me. I quickly attempted to reassure her. Of course we hadn't invited him to the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was more involved in the panic than I realized. Something whispered that we were wrong to leave him behind. The next few days blurred, another night passed, and I heard scratching at the walls, voices calling to me and childlike laughter, and when I stepped outside, I was hit by an unbearable chill. The woods felt alive, breathing, twisting in ways nature shouldn't, a cacophony of whispers beckoning me, saying come play with us. On the fourth day, the atmosphere shifted entirely. My kids began acting differently, more aggressive, thick-lipped smiles stretching beyond the realm of normalcy, their eyes bearing an unnatural light that chilled my spine. "Where's Jamie?" they asked over and over, speaking of him as if he had always been with them. I felt sweat pooling at the base of my neck. I tried to wrangle them away from the shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing hour, and finally, I gathered the courage to venture deeper into the forest alone, driven by an instinct to find Jamie. As I stepped through the trees, whispers became a chorus, begging me to stay, luring me deeper until I stumbled upon a clearing. There, in the center, was a figure dressed in dark clothes, a silhouette of Jamie, but he looked older, almost feral, eyes shrouded in shadow, the edge of his smile vivid against hollow cheeks. My breath hitched as he turned, revealing teeth sharp as knives and an unnatural grin far too wide for his face. "I've been waiting for you," he hissed, his voice crawling beneath my skin, splintering the quiet like thunder. The shadows danced around him, and as they flickered, I felt a wrenching pull inside of me, and as if the woods had conspired, my kids burst into the clearing, eyes glowing, voices harmonizing with Jamie's as they called me to join them. Then came the sound, like a collective heartbeat, an echo of every kid that ever disappeared in those woods. I turned to run, but the shadows wrapped around my legs, their laughter curling around me, pulling me into their realm. And just as I felt myself slipping into the abyss, a sudden thought shattered through the haze: AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation. As that realization hit, this strange bond washed over me. I knew that in denying his invited presence, I had awakened something that should have remained dormant. I stumbled back, gasping, pushing against the tangible dark that swirled around me until I finally broke free, tumbling back toward the safety of our cabin, heart racing, mind screaming. I shut the door, locking it tight, a desperate barricade against the voices. I ordered my children to get their things. We're leaving. I didn't care what they thought. I glanced back at the woods, Jamie standing at the edge, a devilish allure flickering in his darkened figure, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel his gaze burning into my back, burning with the knowledge that every year my sister kept him from us, every vacation we had without him, every time we let the shadows whisper, I was sealing not just my fate, but his legacy, a legacy rising from the depths of the forest where children disappear without a trace, where families fall captive, and in that darkness, a voice would always echo, a question reverberating in the silence. AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece at the last minute would lead to the nightmare that I am now living in. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday night. I had been looking forward to a solo evening binge watching my favorite shows, just curled up in my blanket with a bowl of popcorn, when my sister called. She was in a panicked frenzy because her plans with friends had fallen through at the last minute and she needed someone, anyone, to watch her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. I hesitated, knowing full well that Lily's recent behaviors had made me uncomfortable. In the past few months, she'd been acting strangely, saying odd, almost unsettling things, like how she saw shadows move in the corners of her room or how her dolls would talk to her about things she couldn't possibly have known. I always shrugged it off as childhood imagination or just an overactive mind, but something in my gut twisted at the thought of being alone with her for several hours. I can't, I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. I have plans. The voice on the other end didn't take it well. My sister began to plead, insisting that I was being selfish, but I stood my ground. It's just one night, I thought as I hung up, relieved until I glanced out the window and saw a shadow pass by my front door. It felt ridiculous, I told myself, it was just the wind or some stray cat, maybe even my imagination running wild, but then I heard a light tapping at the glass. I brushed it off as the tree branches swaying in the evening breeze, or maybe just my overactive mind playing tricks on me, until the tapping became a steady knock. My heart raced as I cautiously peeked through the peephole, and for a split second, I saw a small figure standing there, swaying slightly under the porch light. Instinctively, I swung open the door to confront whatever was there, only to see nothing. Just an empty porch, the night air wrapped around me like a heavy cloak. Dismissing everything as some childish prank or a figment of my imagination, I locked the door, shaking my head at my foolishness. I turned back to the TV, trying to immerse myself in the glow of the screen, but kept feeling that sense of dread resting at the back of my mind. As I settled back into the sofa, I convinced myself it was just nerves from the confrontation with my sister. But the unease lingered. I could feel it pressing against my chest, suffocating me as the night dragged on. I decided to distract myself with a few episodes before bed, but just as I'd settled in, my phone buzzed. It was my sister, text after text flooding in. Please, I'm desperate. Lily's acting strange. I need help. Where are you? My stomach twisted as I read her frantic messages. I was about to reply when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of giggles, soft and high-pitched, floating from somewhere outside my window. My heart thumped painfully against my rib cage, and I stood up, moving closer to the window to peer out into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows pooling at the foot of the trees in my yard. But then my eyes caught a flash of something pale, and I noticed it wasn't just shadows dancing in the wind, it was Lily, standing at the edge of my lawn, her hair tangled over her face, her little hands clutching her doll, which seemed impossibly larger than her. Panic erupted in my chest as I realized she'd somehow gotten here despite my refusal. I rushed to the door, flinging it open to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat when I saw her face. She was smiling, and it was wrong, too wide, contorted in a way that felt inhuman, and her eyes glinted in the dark like they were lit from within. "Auntie," she shouted, her voice echoing eerily, sounding less like a child and more like an echo of something dark. "Come play with us." "Us?" I stammered, my stomach churning, but before I could process what was happening, she tilted her head, and the darkness around her seemed to shudder, hundreds of little whispers threading through the air like icy fingers. I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that she wasn't alone. I'd read stories about evil things hiding in the guise of children. I stepped back instinctively, heart racing, but her eyes locked onto mine. They were vacant, swirling like storm clouds. "Don't be scared, Andy. I've brought my friends," she purred, the shadows behind her deepening and looming closer. Panic coursed through my veins, and I slammed the door, retreating to the safety of my home, my mind spinning with the horror of what I had seen. I tried to convince myself it was just a child's folly, a trick of the light, but the knocking started again, more insistent this time. It wasn't a steady knock, though. It felt like fingers, hundreds, scratching at the door, their whispers creeping through the cracks. I fumbled for my phone, contemplating calling my sister, but what would I say? Her daughter was out there with friends? I needed to think. The second I gathered myself to move toward the kitchen for some water, the lights flickered ominously, plunging me into darkness for a heartbeat before they returned. That was when I heard the unmistakable sound of giggling again, now layered with whispers, words tumbling into one another that sent my heart racing. I had to open the door, reassure Lily somehow, tell her it was all okay, but when I cautiously opened it again, instead of the small child, I was met by a hollow laugh that sent ice through my bones. The porch was empty, yet there was a chill in the air that spoke of menace, something lurking just beyond the light. "Auntie, come out and play," echoed through the night, and my instincts screamed for me to retreat. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest as I shut the door, bolting it securely and retreating further into my home, but I could still feel those eyes, those countless eyes watching through the dark, just waiting. I stumbled through the hallway to find a weapon, anything that could offer me a sense of security, when I noticed something on the floor. A small shadow lay near my feet, casting an impossible silhouette on the wall. It was Lily's doll, the one she always carried, its glassy eyes glittering even in the dim light. I recoiled in horror as the whispers intensified, now clearer and rising to a frenzy. "She's not yours anymore. We want her home. Come out, come out." They wrapped around my thoughts, making me feel warm, comfortable, even as dread clawed at my throat. I couldn't let them have her. Suddenly, the lamps flickered, casting chaotic shadows across the room, bringing to life dark silhouettes that danced on the walls. Just when I thought the chaos had reached its peak, a chorus of giggles rang out, echoing all around me. I knew I had to act before it was too late. Rushing to the back door, I grabbed my jacket and flung it on, preparing to face whatever awaited in the dark. But the sounds grew louder, almost jubilant, a cacophony of twisted mirth that echoed through the hall. I gripped the handle and swung the door open, ready to confront whatever shadowy monstrosity awaited, but all I found was the glassy-eyed doll sitting on my step, its pale face turned towards me, grinning, with Lily's giggles chiming in the air. "You can't escape us, Auntie. We're already home." That's when I knew I had made the wrong decision. I choked on my breath, realizing that in refusing to watch my niece, I had invited terror into my life, and the very shadows I thought I'd escaped were now closing in, the whispers wrapping around me, claiming me for their own. AITA for suggesting my teacher host my son's party at her house? It all started innocently enough. My son Ethan had turned 8, and in the excitement of planning his birthday party, I wanted to make it unforgettable. After all, this was the age where friendships began to solidify, and I wanted Ethan to feel special. I had toyed with the idea of renting a hall or throwing a backyard barbecue, but nothing felt quite right. It needed a personal touch, something more intimate. That's when I remembered Ms. Keller, Ethan's third-grade teacher, who had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had a way of bringing magic into mundane lessons, turning math classes into treasure hunts and history into exciting adventures, and I thought, why not? It was a bit of a stretch, but her massive Victorian-style house, filled with books and nooks, could be the perfect backdrop for a meaningful gathering. I approached her after school one day, my heart pounding in my chest, and suggested it as a wild idea. To my surprise, she considered it. Her smile softened into something more contemplative, as she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and nodded thoughtfully, but she never agreed. Weeks passed, and the conversation slipped from memory until I received a text from her, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, where she revealed she had been thinking about hosting the party at her house after all, citing how her own children loved the space. My heart soared. It was the answer I'd dreamed of, and I quickly agreed. The days leading up to the party were filled with excitement and anticipation. Every time Ethan smiled or laughed, I felt like I was on top of the world, relishing the fact that my crazy idea had manifested into reality. Then, the night of the party came. The kids flooded into Ms. Keller's grand home. Laughter echoed through her hallways, filled with the sweet scent of homemade cookies and the sound of balloons popping. I was caught up in a whirlwind of joy, glancing at Miss Keller, who seemed to glide effortlessly between the children, her voice a gentle breeze among the giggles, until everything took a strange turn. Around 9, when half the kids were exhausted, I noticed Ethan drifting toward the basement door, which was slightly ajar, hesitant fingers reaching for the handle. "Ethan, no." I called out, the warning tearing from my lips as I rushed toward him, a sudden chill creeping into my veins. Ms. Keller was right behind me, her smile flickering as she gently reprimanded him, offering a promise of games and laughter above, but the glint in her eyes turned steely for the briefest second, sending a shiver crawling up my spine. I dismissed the incident, attributing my unease to exhaustion, and helped set up the cake. But the atmosphere thickened as the night wore on, the joyous laughter stagnant against an ill wind that seemed to seep in from nowhere. I watched as one by one, the children began to act strangely. They would pause mid-laugh, eyes wide as if something had whispered their names. The cake remained untouched, and the adults murmured amongst themselves, glancing nervously at the basement door that somehow drew attention like a gaping maw ready to swallow the unwary. It creaked open again, and I lost my breath when I saw tiny shadows moving in the dimness, figures that looked like children but were all wrong, limbs out of proportion, faces stretched or twisted in unnatural ways. One child, my neighbor's son, stumbled back up the stairs and pointed a trembling finger toward the door, and I suddenly realized none of the kids had gone in, but rather, something had come out. Ms. Keller quickly ushered them away, her demeanor shifting, sternness painting her features. I was struck by a sense of dread deeper than fear. I fumbled for my phone, frantically attempting to call the police when Ms. Keller approached, an unsettling calm settling over her. "Everything's fine, really," she said, her voice smooth like honey but edged with steel. "Just let them play." Then she looked beyond me and smiled, but I could feel it, a wave of malevolence rolling off her as the basement door creaked open wider, and a chilling breeze clawed at my back. Panic bubbled up inside me as I gripped Ethan's arm and started toward the door, but the children were transfixed, eyes locked on the darkness below. "You're being silly," Ms. Keller whispered with a hint of irritation, glancing over at the basement while the lights flickered ominously. "They just want to play a game." I felt the icy grip of dread tighten around me. The playfulness of the party had warped into something grotesque, as if the children were entranced by the shadowed figures whispering promises they could not resist. I turned and bolted for the door, dragging Ethan with me, but behind me, I could hear Ms. Keller's sweet voice laced with something sinister. "Ethan, we have so much more fun to have down here," she beckoned, her tone shifting like the wind, and everything in me screamed to flee. I yanked him toward the exit just as chaos erupted. The children screamed, not in delight but in pure terror as the twisted forms slinked further into the light, and the laughter turned into shrieks. I burst through the front door, practically tearing Ethan into the night as the darkness behind me stirred, shadows swirling like tempests through Ms. Keller's home. The last thing I saw before slamming the door shut was her eyes, two glimmering voids that seemed to absorb both light and life. We didn't stop running until we reached our car parked at the end of the street, panting and gasping as I shoved Ethan into the passenger seat, fumbling for my keys. It wasn't until we were far away, the glow of Miss Keller's charming house in the distance, that I dared to glance at him, and when I did, everything felt wrong. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but a strange, otherworldly calm, and I realized with dawning horror that he had begun to mimic the same expression I had seen on those twisted children. I glanced back at him, trying to shake off the terror, desperate to hold on to the warmth of normalcy, and as the night deepened around us, doubt crept in. Did I just ruin my son's birthday, or had I unwittingly invited something far worse? I shuddered thinking of Ms. Keller, now a blend of menace and charm, waiting at the edge of darkness for another innocent soul, and with each mile, a single thought screamed in my mind: was this all my fault? I hesitated before hitting the send button, my phone trembling in my sweaty palm as I stared at the message I wrote to my aunt, the woman who had been the thorn in my side for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of relative who offered unsolicited advice and criticized every aspect of my life, from my choice of career to my wardrobe, but when she insisted on coming to my house for my birthday dinner, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It was supposed to be a day for celebration, a day to enjoy with my friends and family, and instead, the evening turned into a twisted family therapy session where I was dissected like a frog in biology class, her sharp tongue skewering my self-esteem. After an hour of her cutting remarks, I snapped, my patience evaporating like water on a hot day, and I blurted out, "I'll never be good enough for you, will I?" All her laughter and condescension stopped, replaced with an icy silence, and for a moment, I reveled in the satisfaction that came from bringing her down a peg. However, that satisfaction was fleeting and morphed into a sick dread when her expression shifted into something unreadable, as if she had just discovered a hidden truth that had lain dormant for years. The silence stretched heavily between us, wrapping the entire room in a smothering shroud, and when my best friend, Mark, attempted to lighten the mood with a joke, laughter just seemed to echo awkwardly around the table, hardly concealing the tension. My aunt finally spoke, her voice low and slow, like molasses oozing out of a jar. "You should really go to your room, dear," she said, and I let out a nervous laugh, thinking she was joking, but her eyes glinted with a mixture of anger and something else that sent a shiver down my spine. I could practically feel the echoes of my words hanging in the air, thick and cloying, as I excused myself and retreated to my room, the walls creeping closer as if they were eavesdropping. It was hours before I heard the sounds of the dinner party winding down, loud chatter interspersed with laughter from Mark that felt far away, an island of normalcy in a sea of dread, but even the laughter couldn't drown out the gnawing in my gut that told me I had crossed a line. When the door creaked open, it was my mother standing there, her face pale. "Your aunt wants to talk to you," she said quietly, and I could see the worry etched on her features. I moved reluctantly, every step weighed down with foreboding until I stepped into the living room, where my aunt sat stiffly on the edge of the couch as if she were so wound up that she might snap. I could feel my heart race, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay, my eyes glued to her, and then she leaned forward, her voice now barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for our family, do you?" I opened my mouth to protest, to ground her words in some semblance of reality, but I was struck dumb by the raw intensity in her gaze. It was as if she were peering into my soul, dissecting all my hidden insecurities, and in a volcanic eruption of emotions that I couldn't control, she admitted something I never saw coming. Her upbringing had been a nightmare. The house was filled with whispers and shadows of unspoken things, and I had been too naive to notice. For what felt like hours, she unraveled the threads of her own pain, stories of family betrayals and lost loves, everything meeting the gnashing of teeth and the silent screams of the night. I wanted to comfort her, but the more she spoke, the more disoriented I became, ideas of comfort clashing with the venomous way she treated me, and in this warped tapestry of her life, I saw reflection, not just of herself, but a reflection of how she viewed me, as a failure with no hope in her eyes. When she finally fell silent, I stood frozen, the weight of this revelation heavy on my chest as I struggled to find the words to fill the void that had opened between us. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but there was something fractured in her expression. She gazed at me with an intensity I couldn't fathom, and just below the surface, I sensed her disappointment, a flicker of pain that ignited into a wildfire. She leaned closer, seemingly brimming with a need to impart her final lesson. "You must understand, it's not about being good enough, it's about survival. Life is unforgiving, and if you can't understand that, then you have no hope." At that moment, I felt a shiver ripple across my spine. It felt like a threat wrapped in wisdom, a chilling portent of what awaited me beyond the confines of this moment. My pulse quickened, and as I stumbled backward, I could feel that same creeping sensation that had haunted me since I was a child. I turned and fled upstairs, shutting the door behind me, pushing my back against it as if barricading myself against her presence. But the moment I felt safe, the shadows in my room shifted, flickering like candlelight, and I whimpered at the encroaching darkness. It wasn't until later, curled under my soft blanket, that I heard the muffled echoes of conversation between my mother and my aunt downstairs, their voices entwined like two serpents fighting for dominance, until I finally embarked on the road to sleep, where night after night, my dreams morphed into nightmares, my aunt's words haunting me like a sinister refrain, repeating over and over until they carved grooves into my mind, sometimes morphing her face into something monstrous that loomed over me. Days bled into weeks, and while my aunt eventually left, the tension never quite dissipated. I found myself looking over my shoulder as if at any moment her icy presence would return to taunt me, the weight of our conversation still thick and oppressive, suffocating the air around me. And then the dreams grew darker, twisting into something grotesque, her voice echoing with the laughter of children, mocking me while I went untouched, trapped in a glass box that no one else could see. And during those nights, I found myself screaming for my mom, reaching for the warmth of the real world, but she couldn't hear me. I started to notice subtle shifts too, small things like objects moving in my periphery, shadows stretching in ways that defied reason, and an uneasiness burrowing itself in my bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. That sense of dread culminated on a particularly stormy night when a crack of thunder shook my room awake and I looked up to see someone standing in the shadows, the silhouette barely detectable in the darkness. But just as I was about to convince myself it was a trick of the light, I recognized the warm outline of my aunt. Her expression twisted into something terrible, smiling cruelly, a manifestation of my own fears given flesh. And in that instant, I finally understood the words she'd said. They weren't merely warnings or lessons, they were a curse set to ensnare my soul. I bolted up from my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal, frantically scrambling for the light switch that ultimately betrayed me by turning on with an unsettling flicker. Yet there was no sign of her. The room was empty but still suffused with that same malignant energy, and I collapsed onto my bed in a heap of raw nerves, unable to process what I'd just experienced. Over the next few weeks, my mental state unraveled. I found myself questioning reality, my own perceptions morphing into a living nightmare, and as the sun filtered through my window, scattering light across my face, it felt like every shadow carried a dagger aimed straight at my heart, until one night, as desperation clawed violently at the edges of my mind, I confronted my mother, voice trembling. I expressed my fears, told her what I had seen, but her face mirrored only disbelief, and that made it worse. She didn't understand. She thought I was merely acting out, a child unwilling to accept the terms of adulthood. It felt as though my words floated into a void, unheard and uncared for, and that's when I realized I had no one to turn to. Weeks became months, my studies suffered, friendships strained, and the isolation consumed me, until one evening when I finally broke down, throwing a glass against the wall, the shards littering my room like fragments of my crumbling sanity. I wished I had been kinder to my aunt, wished I hadn't shouted at her, but wishful thinking morphed into deafening silence as I stood amidst the wreckage, trying to fathom my spiraling demise. Then it hit me, a radical thought that filled me with dread and clarity all at once. What if her curse was digging its claws deeper and deeper with each passing day? My mind was a battlefield of frantic thoughts. Maybe she was right all along. I was destined to be a failure. I could feel it in every shaky breath, every restless night, and one desperate line of hope strung tight in my heart. I needed to confront her, unleash whatever darkness she had thrust upon me. So, without thinking, I dialed her number, each ring like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning, and when she picked up, that familiar sing-song voice filled the air. "Hello, dear." I could hear the sweet undercurrent of condescension wrapping itself around her words, and I steeled myself, daring to confront my fears. "What did you do to me?" I managed to choke out, the words tumbling raw and unhinged, but there was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought I had lost her. And then she laughed, a chilling sound that echoed down my spine like icy fingers tracing my vertebrae. "Oh honey, that was just the beginning," she said, and I realized, right then, what terrible sacrifice she had made. No, not for the family, but to ensure that I would carry the burden of her darkness, a parasite feeding off my mistakes. With every accusation I hurled at her now, I felt smaller, more defeated. She fed off my fear, reshaping it into something twisted and wholly her own, until finally, with one last mocking laugh, she hung up, leaving me holding a phone in a vice grip as silence enveloped me. And just as the last flicker of hope threatened to evaporate, I realized something. I wasn't the one who had been cast aside, but I would be the one who would have to break the cycle. And with that ephemeral thought, everything narrowed into sharp focus. Bursts of determination surging through my veins. She could no longer control me, and while the haunting laughter lingered, a defiant fire ignited in my stomach. Just like the day I stood up for myself with words that chafed but were necessary, I would unravel her grip, confront every shadow, and refuse to be her puppet anymore. AITA for what I said to my aunt? Yes, perhaps. But what I'll do next, how I choose to take ownership of my life from here on out? That's the real question, isn't it? It's time to rise from the ashes she left behind. When I was a little girl, I dreamt of my wedding day with a fervor that would make even the most hard-hearted cynical adult roll their eyes, and if you had asked me then, I would have told you that my dream dress was a breathtaking pink gown, the kind that twirled like cotton candy beneath layered lights at sunset. Fast forward to my engagement, and my fiancé, Derek, was everything I could ask for. His smile lit up my world, and his laughter felt like home. But when I finally unveiled my cherished vision of a pink wedding dress to him, the look on Derek's face fell faster than I could catch it. He chuckled, which only deepened the crease across his brow. I pictured white, you know. Traditional. For the photos. As if my heart hadn't already begun to sink, I tried to brush off his hesitation, assuring him that love was what mattered most, and pink could be the essence of our shared joy. I revisited the boutique alone, the walls decorated in thousands of hues of white, and there, hanging like a forgotten story, was my original vision, a delicate pink dress, with a satin underlay that shimmered like the dawn. I slipped it on and stood before the mirror, and for the briefest moment, I felt perfect. I chose to go ahead with what my heart desired and marked the day with pink every step of the way, a pink cake, pink flowers, even pink shoes. What should have been a joyful time took a perilous turn when I announced those plans at our engagement party, where friends and family gathered, the city skyline glowing behind them. Family members gave polite claps, but I noticed my mother's jaw tighten and my grandmother's eyes narrow. What happened to the beautiful white wedding dresses? My mother questioned, her tone dripping with disapproval. It felt as if the air thickened, my smile wavering under the weight of their stares. Derek, after lagging behind with a muted expression, pulled me aside later, voicing his concerns in a hushed whisper, words about tradition and expectations spilling forth, drowning me in regret. You know it's important to my family, right? The doubt nestled itself in my stomach like a lead weight. My heart raced as he tried to convince me that I should reconsider, but it was too late to turn back. I was headfirst submerged in a sea of satin pink and deep disappointment. I had visions of our special day twisting like a terrifying dream I couldn't wake from, and the anxiety seeped into the planning, igniting late-night arguments that pushed him away from me instead of drawing us closer. The week before the wedding loomed like a storm cloud, the colors clashed so vividly with the black and white portrait of my future in-law's expectations. I couldn't sleep, the pink parasol and blush decorations filling every corner of my mind like quicksand. It was like a haunting chorus, and just before I drifted into a restless sleep, I found myself centered once more, a dreamlike image of walking down an aisle of happiness. All that mattered was our love and not the color of my dress. Then, on the day before the wedding, I received a message from my brother. Mom and Dad are fighting. It's bad. A wave of dread washed over me as I found myself torn between my loyalty to my family and my heart's desire. The chasm widened between my decisions, and on the fateful morning, I donned my pink dress alone in the hotel suite, my mother's disapproval echoing like a ghost trapped between and among all the swirling laughter of pre-wedding chaos. The sight of myself sent adrenaline rushing through my veins. I did look beautiful. As the ceremony began, however, I spotted Derek's family, shoulders rigid and jaws tight. My heart sank further with every step that carried me into their line of sight. Their eyes, void of understanding, chased away the joyful spark I had longed for. By the time we exchanged vows in front of our loved ones, I felt a churning pit of anxiety in my stomach. I wished for one person to embrace me and validate my choices, and yet I found only silence from my family's corner. The flush of embarrassment was invaded further, creeping in like vines on ancient stone. After the ceremony, as we danced surrounded by a bittersweet haze of joy and resentment, my grandmother confronted me about my foolhardiness. You won't honor tradition? On a day meant to bind your families. Her words were like shards of glass, and I fought the urge to scream. I tried to defend my actions, a flimsy paper boat riding the turbulent waves of emotion, and soon the reception spiraled into chaos. Derek's voice pierced through the crowd, a mix of frustration and disappointment mirrored in his eyes as I stood before my family and his, my pink dress like bandages on wounds that would never heal. The noise blurred into a cacophony of judgment and misunderstanding, laughter stained with unceremonious rejection, and in that moment, I felt a distinct fracture forming. The tension thickened so much that it became impossible to navigate. The phone rang, breaking the anguished silence that shifted our worlds into turmoil. My father, voice tremulous, came hurtling into the room. You need to come home. Now. Panic rose within me, as dread settled deep in my bones, an omen I couldn't escape. I thought about that pink dress, now drenched in symbolic blood. What was a celebration had become a battleground, leaving behind only the ruins of my dreams hanging like broken glass. When Derek saw the fear flashing in my eyes, he took my hand, pulling us away from their judging glares. "We'll make this right," he whispered, but I had no idea what that meant, whether our love could withstand the chaos we had unleashed. Yet a sliver of hope pierced through the shadows as we stepped beyond the threshold of acceptance and rejection, the pink fabric swirling around me, a whirlwind of sorrow and love intertwined. In those moments filled with disbelief, it became painfully clear that weddings shouldn't be a battlefield, yet here we found ourselves entrenched. Now a question ignited within: AITA for drama over a pink wedding dress? As I processed the fallout creeping into our lives, one thing was certain: it would take more than a color to define the love we were scrambling to salvage. When my cousin Morgan invited me to her graduation party, I was excited but also apprehensive. She had always been the golden child, and I never really measured up. So when I discovered through a mutual friend that she'd actually paid her way through an online diploma mill, a secret she vehemently tried to keep under wraps, I felt compelled to confront her in a way I never had before. As I arrived at the lavishly decorated backyard where Instagram-ready balloons floated like pastel clouds and a makeshift wooden stage awaited the valedictorian speech, I saw Morgan basking in the glow of attention, glamorous in her cap and gown, but something about her smile felt rehearsed, a facade that cracked when I caught her in a whispered conversation with her mother, her eyes betraying a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the dread that shadowed her achievement. The tension spiraled as I witnessed her proudly accepting faux accolades from family members who knew nothing about the truth, their hearts too eager to embrace the lie she had spun, and despite my reservations, I found myself standing closer than I should have, caught in a tide of bitter resentment and the sinking realization that the very fabric of our familial love was woven by deception. When the moment arrived, and the spotlight danced its way to me, I felt a surge of jealousy threaten to overthrow my sanity as I grasped the microphone, and almost involuntarily, I blurted out, "Congratulations, Morgan. But I guess it's not my fault you bought your degree." The gasps were audible, a sharp intake of air that split the warm afternoon like thunder, and Morgan's expression shifted instantly from shock to rage, the kind that transformed her cherubic face into a monstrous reflection of pure betrayal. Struggling to maintain my composure under the onslaught of disdainful glares from shocked relatives, I felt a rush of adrenaline, knowing I had thrown a match into a sea of dry kindling. It was a chaotic flurry of shouting voices and clattering utensils, her mother gasping as if I had slapped her across the face. Morgan lunged at me, fists flying, but I didn't back down. My voice echoed like a battle cry as I shouted back about the years spent on her high horse while I worked hard for every scrap of recognition I ever got. The guests' faces were a grim collage of disappointment and concern as Morgan choked back tears and accused me of ruining her day, insisting that our family's blood and humor had always been worth celebrating. But I stood firm in my accusation, questioning the very essence of her achievement, a hyena's laugh punctuating the tension as I pointed to her stack of ceremony photos where every smile seemed to mock the truth, and in that moment, her mask slipped away entirely, revealing the dread underneath. The argument devolved into an exhibition of dirty laundry dragged through the sunshine, where her past transgressions and insecurities collided with my burdens, creating an intangible fissure between us that I feared could never be mended, all eyes piercing through me with an intensity I had never felt before, until suddenly, an older relative stepped in, an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, who claimed to know everything, or at least our family folklore, and in that uncanny silence that followed his boisterous entry, I realized I wasn't alone in feeling weighed down by each lie we had ever entertained. It seemed there were whispers buried beneath the layers of our gatherings, and somehow I had exposed an unseen reality that shook the very roots of our idyllic narratives, and as the evening devolved into something grotesque, I felt the atmosphere shift as Morgan's confidence withered, beaten down by the harsh glare of scrutiny while our relatives circled her like vultures, waiting for her to admit her mistake amidst the chaos I had ignited. Days melted into nights, turning that party into a cursed memory, an echo reverberating in my mind where guilt twisted with vindication. I became the antagonist in my family's story, labeled as the villain who dared to expose the truth in the face of a flawless facade, while Morgan slipped deeper into denial, swaddled by the lies she had built her life upon until her phone began buzzing like a hornet's nest. Yet the only messages I received were warnings from friends out of fear of family repercussions for having spoken my mind. A week later, I awoke to a world shimmering with silence. The calls from my family had ceased, the chatter turned hollow, and every gathering near my doorstep became a reminder of the rift I had created, until Morgan's mother called me with that threatening tone, implying that I had pulled the curtain on a family scandal too sinister to ignore and told me that if I valued our relationship at all, I would confess and apologize. But I staunchly held my ground, knowing deep down our world was riddled with secrets worth preserving. But as tension morphed into shadows, something shifted in the air. Whispers followed me through the streets as eye contact became a dangerous commodity among family, where every encounter felt like a trial for my transgressions. And one particularly lonely night, as I sat on my porch nursing regrets, Morgan appeared without warning, her eyes clouded with uncertainty but her resolve sparked like wildfire. The once inseparable bond now lay ruptured, festering wounds of jealousy and betrayal threatening to drown any flicker of hope. She confessed that she had lived in fear, unable to tell anyone the truth about how she felt trapped in the mirage of success she had crafted, the facade becoming a noose as constricting as the expectations her mother thrust upon her. I watched her as she broke down, everything she personified crumbling into a cascade of tears. I thought this vulnerability might grant us the catharsis needed, but instead, the revelation left a bitter taste that thickened the already toxic atmosphere. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere thickened with dread, but I could not shake the feeling that I had unleashed something dark and vast into our lives. But it wasn't until Morgan threatened to seek her truth among strangers and let the world see what lay beneath our collective skin, that I understood how fragile our positions were. Each word we exchanged now felt like blades sharp enough to cleave the very fabric of our belonging, and I wondered if I had become the architect of my own isolation, torn between the vindication of honesty and the warmth of denial that had wrapped us like a cocoon for too long. When the day finally dawned, bright yet oppressive, I found myself spiraling, the daylight harsh against my regret as Morgan prepared to reveal all on social media. My heart pounded like a war drum, my vision tunneled in on the inevitable pain, but when she finally pressed send, I was left gasping in shock as the floodgates opened. Those who had smiled at her celebration turned into virtual haters, cloaked in anonymity yet wielding their venom like knives as they punctured her facade, leaving Morgan in the ruins of her own making, shattered pieces drifting away as their words became anchors that dragged her deeper into despair. In the aftermath, as relatives distanced themselves and the truth morphed into its own gelatinous monster, I wondered whether I had been right all along or merely too cowardly to save us from the inevitable. And as Morgan sat in a self-constructed prison of hate and sorrow, I learned through the lens of my own brokenness that sometimes, saying the hard truth reveals scars too deep to heal, leaving behind a silence that echoes louder than any shout of victory could ever hope to drown. I never thought a simple act of love would spiral into a nightmare, but here I am, trapped in a dark web of regret and horror. It all began when my daughter, Claire, who had been a vibrant light in my life, introduced me to her partner, Mia, and their gorgeous twin daughters, Lily and Rose. They were the kind of girls who left trails of glitter and laughter wherever they went, but with their busy lives and my own responsibilities, I felt that a handmade gesture would reconnect us all. So, I spent weeks sewing two cozy, colorful quilts adorned with intricate patterns of flowers and butterflies, one for each girl. The day I presented them, the delight in their eyes made every cut and stitch worth it, and at that moment, I basked in their joy, never knowing the darkness that lay ahead. It wasn't long after that, on a seemingly ordinary weekend, that strange things began to happen. It started when Lily fell ill with what Claire insisted was a common cold, but the next day, Rose also came down with the same symptoms. Then, a week later, Claire reached out to me in a panic. The girls had developed strange rashes on their arms and legs that seemed to flare up after curling up under the very quilts I had made. I felt a prick of unease, but I dismissed it, thinking it must have been an adverse reaction to the fabric I had used. "They'll be fine," I reassured her, though my heart was pounding as I hung up the phone. Then, more disturbing occurrences began to pile up. The family's cat, a fluffy tabby named Muffin, went missing, and one night I distinctly heard hushed voices coming from the girls' room. Concerned, I knocked, and Claire opened the door just enough to peek through, her face as pale as the moonlight illuminating the hallway. I could see the girls huddled under the blankets, whispering, but not talking to anyone as I recognized, perhaps playing some innocent game. Yet their giggles seemed unnaturally high-pitched and echoed unsettlingly in my ears. I brushed it off as growing pains of parenthood and carried on, crafting more quilts to send their way in a futile attempt to brush the darkness away. That wrong turn led me down a path of disbelief when one evening, as I looked through my sewing supplies, I stumbled upon something horrifying, tiny strips of fabric that looked almost like hair. Horrified, I collapsed into a parent's worst nightmare. The girls weren't just playing, they were weaving something darker than I could fathom. I found myself waking up in cold sweats, the images of my beloved grandchildren flickering in flame-like visions, the sound of their laughter turning into shrill screams. Barely sleeping, I found myself almost instinctively checking in on them more often, but each visit felt more shadowy than the last. One Friday night, driven by an unfathomable pull, I decided to follow those haunting whispers. It led me to the door of their room once more, but this time something shifted in me. Instead of fear, a deep curiosity consumed me. Peeking through the crack made my breath hitch. The girls were seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a circle of candles illuminating a strange symbol drawn in chalk. Before them lay the quilts, their colors appearing almost too vibrant, too alive, and they were using them as an altar of sorts. I opened the door wider, my heart hammering, to find the girls chanting in a language I couldn't comprehend, their innocent faces now twisted into something unsettling, eyes too old for their little bodies, gleaming with a hunger I had never seen before. They turned to me in unison and smiled, revealing teeth that glinted unnaturally in the candlelight. "Join us, Grandma," they chimed, voices thick with something unnameable. I didn't know what to do. Every maternal instinct screamed for me to pull them away from whatever malevolence they were dabbling in, yet another part of me, perhaps the deeper, darker part, was both terrified and fascinated. I backed away, closing the door quietly, wanting to give them space while also terrified for their safety. I tried calling Claire, but my hands shook too violently to dial correctly as dread choked me. The following week spiraled out of control. The more I tried to distance myself from the girls, the more the dark energy seemed to repulse me. It became evident to me that their rashes had worsened, and I saw a subtle change in Claire too: tangled hair, dark circles under her eyes, a sense of fatigue that aged her rapidly. When I finally managed to pry it from her lips, Claire admitted the girls had started talking about the night of offerings and other strange rituals, things that had no place in a child's imagination, and I felt faint. Panic surged through my veins. I needed to act before it spiraled completely out of control, but every time I tried to confront Mia and Claire, they brushed it off as just childhood imagination, but as their grandmother, I couldn't shake that feeling. I snuck around their house one night while they were out, trying to gather anything unusual. In the attic, buried beneath old toys, I found a tattered book filled with illustrations of symbols and relentless incantations. I flipped through it, confusion giving way to horror as the truth struck me: a dark lineage, a twisted legacy that my family seemed to have avoided, but now threatened to awaken with my innocent gestures of love. I ripped the book shut and stumbled out of the house, barely breathing, feeling the weight of my actions suffocate me. The quilting I thought would bind our family together was pulling me into something far more sinister. A choice had to be made. I began to cut ties, slowly withdrawing from their lives, desperate to protect my own sanity, but the girls grew more insistent, more invasive, as if sensing my fear and reluctance. At a family gathering later, I watched them closely. Something shifted in me when Rose smiled at me, a smile that seemed almost predatory. I felt as though she knew the truth of my cowardice. When I could take it no longer, I gathered everyone and blurted out all I had found, all that I had deciphered from the tattered book. Instead of disbelief, their laughter filled the air again, but it felt different, sharp and menacing. "It's not a game, Grandma," they said in unison, voices layered with something vile that chilled my very spirit. It was too late, I couldn't escape this. As Claire and Mia exchanged glances filled with acknowledgement, my heart sank. "You made a mistake," Claire said, and I felt my pulse quicken. I thought about the blankets, the love I had poured into those quilts, and it hit me: the offerings they spoke of were not mere children's games, and now I knew I was not just the innocent grandmother in this twisted tale. I had woven my own entrapment with every stitch and thread. I looked into the girls' eyes, shivers racing down my spine, realizing that they had drawn me into their machinations far deeper than I dared to believe, and it was there, nestled inside those blankets, where the true monstrosity lay waiting for the moment they decided to claim it. "So," I ask again, "AITA for making my lesbian daughter's children blankets?" I always thought the engagement ring my grandmother bequeathed to me was just a family heirloom, sparkling with history and nostalgic whispers of love, but ever since her funeral, it transformed into something else entirely, something sinister. When she passed away, my mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching at her heart as if it might burst from grief. Amidst the echoes of mourning, I received the delicate ring, an intricate weave of gold, encrusted with a single brilliant diamond that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own under the flickering chapel lights. For days, I kept it hidden in a small velvet pouch in my drawer, overwhelmed by not just the weight of loss, but the sense of obligation that accompanied such a treasured legacy. My mother, however, started dropping hints about how it rightfully belonged to her, how it was part of our family's bloodline, and how I shouldn't keep it for myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the ring was meant for me, and the fiery tug-of-war between familial loyalty and personal desire only intensified when I put it on. I swear I could hear my grandmother's voice whispering to me in the silence of my lonely room, coaxing me to protect it, to honor it. Then, the odd things began to happen. Shadows stretched across my walls, dark fingers creeping along the edges of my vision when I was alone at night, and every time I caught a glance of my reflection while wearing the ring, I felt a stranger staring back at me, but with my grandmother's warm smile creeping into her lips. My mother grew more frantic, restless, even desperate, and I began to piece together a darker story, one where the ring was a vessel for my grandmother's spirit, fiercely protective and unyielding. A week later, in a feverish dream, I found myself sitting at an enormous old table surrounded by flickering candles. My grandmother sat across from me, her smile soothing yet demanding. "This is your responsibility now," she said, her voice echoing off the walls like a forgotten lullaby, and even in the dream realm, I could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing against my chest. I woke up sweating, the ring still settling into the cool, clammy skin of my finger, a reminder that whatever this was, it flowed far deeper than a mere inheritance. It was legacy, it was obligation, it was power. My mother, however, had a darker intention. She wasn't just mourning, she was scheming, obsessively trying to reclaim the ring as if snuffing out my claim would sever some invisible link to our family's history. Anxiety gripped me, twisting my thoughts into frenzied knots. Who did I trust? Weeks dragged on, and I felt the shadow of my grandmother's spirit wrapping tighter around me as whispers morphed into bolder calls for protection. One night, she was more vivid than ever, her voice an intoxicating melody laced with urgency. "It's not safe anymore," she warned, making me question what I'd stumbled into. Paranoid and restless, I began to notice my mother getting darker, her mood shifting inconsistently like a thunderstorm churning in the distance, and the way she looked at me began to shift, from concern to an unsettling intensity that made cold trickles dance down my spine. I told her I would not give back the ring, and the clash between us felt like a rift splitting through the very fabric of our family. It was on that night, amid the hazy air of our argument, that the electrical hum of energy crackled, and the lights flickered as if my grandmother's spirit was the very essence fueling the atmosphere. My mother's voice darkened, exposing a bitter undercurrent intertwined with anger and sorrow, revealing that she believed I was chosen to carry a curse rather than a blessing. A bone-chilling laugh erupted from her throat, twisting my insides into knots, an echo I'd never encountered before. That night, sleep was a distant memory as dread gnawed at my gut, yet finally, exhausted and restless, I slipped into slumber sometime after dawn, prompting my mind to play tricks on me as I entered a world where the walls swirled like shadows. My dreams morphed, becoming grotesque and vivid, filled with whispers like a low hum echoing around a cavernous chamber, the very essence of my grandmother enveloping me, melding past and future. I saw visions of my mother, filled with rage and desperation, lunging for the ring that sat snugly on my finger, and with each harrowing vision, the weight of her fury clawed at my insides. When morning finally arrived, a surge of dread spiraled down my spine, pushing me to confront the reality that lay ahead. I ventured downstairs only to find the house still as a grave, and the air felt thick with an unsettling tension, the remnants of the argument hanging heavy like fog. I reached for the delicate ring only to find it had vanished from my nightstand, and panic gripped me. Where could it be? My heart thudded violently as I trudged through the house, searching high and low until I stumbled into my mother's dimly lit study. In the center of the room stood my mother, clutching the ring with feather-light fingers, a manic glimmer alight in her eyes that sent my heart racing and my defenses rising. "You don't understand, do you?" she hissed, her voice woven with a cunning that chilled my bones. I was taken aback, every part of me screamed to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but the air between us crackled with an energy that felt almost ancient. Within her eyes, I glimpsed something dark, and suddenly the realization hit, and I understood the truth. It was more than just a ring, it was a battleground for our grandmother's spirit, a catalyst seeking to protect what once was, sparring between desire and duty, life and death. But before I could grasp the weight of that revelation, my mother raised her hands, clutching the ring like a talisman, refusing to accept its rightful fate. In that moment, the temperature in the room plunged, and a shadow loomed behind her, clearer than day. It was my grandmother, her face twisted in indignation, furious that we were tearing ourselves apart over something that was supposed to symbolize love. Everything spiraled out of control in that tense standoff, voices growing louder, breaths quickening, and as my mother let out a primal scream, the ring began to tremble as the spectral figure flared to life, her voice deafening, filled with a tidal wave of anguish and fury. "Release it to the one who knows the truth. It was never yours to take," she declared, and just like that, amidst a whirlwind of emotions, the house began to shake violently, glasses shattering while chaos reigned, leaving me standing there, the weight of decision crashing down like a tidal wave, because in that moment, I realized it wasn't about giving back the ring, it was about reclaiming the love it represented and making a choice. So no, I didn't give back the engagement ring. I chose to embrace the echoes of my family's love, to acknowledge what my grandmother whispered through the void, where grief and fear dance hand in hand. And eventually, it became clear, some inheritances are a burden, but they also shine a profound light on who we choose to become amid the chaos, though the shadows still linger, and I wonder if the whispers will ever truly fade. When my husband, Mark, met Tyler at the gym, I thought it was harmless. I was glad to see him making a new friend after years of long nights working his sales job. But as their friendship blossomed, spontaneous workouts, late-night phone calls, and weekend outings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become a ghost in my own home, a specter hovering over what used to be our strong family unit, especially as our family tradition of Sunday dinners began to wither like a neglected plant. It felt foreign, like watching someone else take my place at the head of the table where we once laughed and shared stories. I tried to be supportive, reminding him of our Sunday gatherings that had anchored us through both good and bad times, but each time I brought it up, he brushed me off with a half-hearted, "We can do it next week." Weeks turned into months, and soon we were only eating dinner together when he was too tired to go out with Tyler. My frustration turned into resentment. I tried confronting him, but every time I mentioned how much our tradition meant to me, Mark threw in an eye roll as if I were an old-fashioned relic, stuck in a past he had outgrown. The Sundays I had cherished turned into silent nights filled with cold pasta and leftover memories, and though I hoped he would see how much I was suffering, it felt like I was speaking into a void. That's when everything changed. Tyler invited us out to a fancy restaurant downtown, and Mark, without checking with me, enthusiastically accepted, trying to mask the guilt beneath his excitement. I had reached a tipping point by then. The idea of my family tradition being outclassed by what I saw as a fleeting friendship snapped something inside me. I told Mark, absolutely desperate for his attention, that I wanted him to prioritize our family traditions over this new friendship, but instead of seeing my pain, he exploded in frustration, accusing me of being controlling and jealous of his friendships, hurling words like selfish and old-fashioned at me like daggers. On that fateful Sunday, when he chose to go out with Tyler instead of coming home for the traditional meal we'd wrestled to prepare together, I felt an icy grip clench around my heart. Alone in the kitchen, I meticulously set the table for a family that no longer existed in the way I longed for it to. When the clock ticked past the hour we would typically start eating, shadowy memories whipped around me, our kids giggling as they waged food fights, Mark's booming laugh filling the air, the sweet smell of garlic bread wafting through the house as though it were the very essence of our shared life. Then, as if on cue, a knock echoed through the silence, startling me. When I answered, I was met not with Mark and his sly smirk but with Tyler, who wore an expression of shame and good intention that I couldn't quite place. He stood there, holding a large bouquet of lifeless flowers and an empty food container marked takeout. Ty. I felt a rush of emotions crash inside me, anger, confusion, and a deep sorrow riveted my resolve, but before I could identify one coherent thought, he started to speak. Mark had this at the restaurant, told me he'd be home soon, but... He trailed off, looking remorseful while guilt oozed from his body like sweat after a long workout. And just like that, I realized that I was not just losing Mark but all the warmth the family held had crumbled like decaying leaves. Tyler's voice trembled as he said, "He wanted to keep going with our friendship, but I didn't know you were feeling this way when I invited him." With Tyler standing there, I felt every sunbeam of hope vanish, the air thickening with unspoken truths. He didn't even understand. How could he? Mark had grown so entranced by this new life that the shadows of our past had intruded upon my very soul. When I finally raised my voice, I felt emboldened, accusing them both of neglect and disrespect. You think friendship's easy, but family is built on something deeper. It's respect, loyalty, and moments shared over years. You can't just glamorize a flicker and let it drown out a flame, I shouted, voice cracking, losing its strength as Tyler seemed to shrink before me, a boy caught in the crossfire of a battle he never wanted to join. I just wanted him to have fun, he muttered, eyes cast downward. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt a torrent of emotions bubble inside me. Deep down, I knew Tyler was merely a conduit for a chasm that had formed between Mark and me, rooted in neglect and bitterness. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Mark stepped in, laughter echoing against the walls, jangling like bells on a frayed wire. He paused, taking in the sight before him, me, standing defensively, Tyler looking about ready to fold in on himself, and suddenly it struck me that I had become the villain in this narrative. "What's going on?" Mark asked, the laughter draining from his voice. I stood there, trembling, feeling immeasurable anger but also a pang of desperation as I fought to find the right words. "Mark, you're losing us." The syllables formed a shaky confession laden with heartache, and it was as if the room began to tilt, shadows shifting ominously as the truth of my pain spilled out into the open air. In that agonizing moment, vulnerability consumed me, and I saw Mark's face crack open, confusion swirling with realization. Could we claw our way back to the shared memories we used to laugh about like old friends? Could he embrace our tradition instead of dismissing it for something ephemeral? Silence fell heavy between us, and I knew we were all standing precariously on the edge of a broken promise, one thread still connecting us to the flaking facade of our home life, closely adhered to a memory that was slowly being eroded by the tide of indifference. I used to think conflicts in marriage were easy to resolve. After all, how hard could it be to express your feelings about something that's bothering you? But that was before the Fruit Loops incident, the night everything changed between my husband Eric and me. It began innocently enough. I was exhausted after a long day at work, and as I shuffled into the kitchen, I spotted Eric happily indulging in a massive bowl of cereal, the artfully vibrant loop smothered in milk, his face illuminated by the glow of the fridge light. I greeted him with a smile, expecting just a quiet moment to connect after a hectic day, but the atmosphere soured when I saw he already had a second bowl prepared, as if realizing he'd need it to satiate some insatiable hunger I didn't even know he had. My initial amusement turned to annoyance as he spooned a heaping helping into his mouth, the sound of the cereal crunching echoing in the dimly lit kitchen, like a cruel remix of my own spiraling frustration. "Are you really going to eat that much?" I asked, trying to inject a hint of humor into my comment, but Eric shot me a glare that poured ice down my spine. "What?" "It's just cereal," he replied, voice tinged with defensiveness as if I'd accused him of committing heinous acts. It struck me that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, so I shrugged it off and made myself a much smaller bowl, but the unease lingered like a ghost I couldn't shake. I sat across from him, and we could barely look at each other as the silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons and slurping milk, hollow reminders of our widening disconnect. Trying to break the suffocating tension, I suggested we talk about our days, sharing a story about a coworker's mishap that had everyone in stitches, but Eric nodded in response, his focus unwavering from the bowl as if I were speaking an entirely different language. I could feel rage bubbling beneath my skin, a helplessness morphing into something primal, and I couldn't help but feel he was deliberately ignoring me. Finally, in a moment of clarity wrapped in a shroud of frustration, I blurted out, "It's kind of selfish to hog all the cereal, you know." Silence ensued. Eric's spoon clattered against the bowl, the sound sending a shockwave through my chest. "Selfish? You think eating a bowl of cereal makes me selfish?" he asked incredulously, his voice rising, anger twisting his features into something I almost didn't recognize. I was tired. "Just because I want to enjoy my food doesn't mean I'm putting myself before you." The atmosphere became thick with unsaid words. I felt a reservoir of tears threaten to spill over, and I wasn't sure why I felt so shut out. My unease blossomed into outright confusion because it was just cereal, wasn't it? What did it even mean when we hurled accusations back and forth like cold cuts at a deli, the oddity of the situation spiraling toward an absurd conclusion? "You're making a big deal out of nothing," Eric spat, indignant, and for a fleeting second, his ire glanced off my armor of hurt. Perhaps I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But then came a wave of bitterness that I couldn't ignore. Wasn't this about more than Fruit Loops? It was about our relationship, the chasm that had grown between us, countless nights of silence more poignant than words, several missed connections disguised as life's daily grind. I felt utterly alone in my desire to bridge that gap, a rhythmic pulse pounding in my ears as he continued to scoff at my words, chewing through each syllable as if they were the very cereal he deemed more important than our conversation. The bowl became a battleground as I accused him of being neglectful, focusing on superficial things instead of the underlying issues that screamed for attention. If I can't even talk to you about our basic needs, who am I to share my life with you? I felt raw, exposed, like a creature caught in the harsh light of his casual apathy, but he refused to budge, scoffing as he dug into another helping, the brightly colored pieces swimming in milk, blissfully unaware of the maelstrom of emotions swirling just a few inches away. I got up, slammed my bowl in the sink, and stomped toward our bedroom, where the weight of my words loomed over me. I slumped against the door, trying to catch my breath as I felt the tears tumble down my cheeks. Am I the entitled one here? The nagging voice inside me echoed as guilt washed over like a tidal wave. But rather than reflecting on my own pain, I wondered if he could truly remain indifferent while the world burned around him. This was more than cereal. It was the way he could eat so blithely while ignoring the hollow sounds of our lives barely touched by intimacy. Hours passed, my thoughts spiraled until they felt tangible, raw like a wound, and when I heard the soft patter of his footsteps creeping toward our bedroom, I thought maybe we could reconcile. But instead, Eric stood at the threshold, and before I could even summon a calm demeanor, he mumbled something unintelligible that sounded much like an apology but felt entirely hollow, just a way to end the night without earnestness. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, shame shimmering briefly only to collapse under the weight of his pride. I muttered something back, words soaked in resentment, and, in that moment, in that oh-so-ordinary kitchen illuminated with memories and the smell of fading milk, I realized his dinner was more than a bowl of cereal. It had come to symbolize everything gnawing at us beneath the surface, the inability to dig deeper, the hesitance to face what was truly wrong. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, allowing exhaustion to wash over me, yet sleep eluded as I replayed the events of the night like a reel in slow motion. In that ache of solitude, I understood something crucial. It wasn't about cereal anymore, it was about feeling unseen. The next morning was a chilly void of unspoken words. You could cut the tension with a knife as neither of us acknowledged what had transpired. Eric settled back into his routine, stepping lightly with precise purpose, brewing coffee while I poured cereal, determining to trudge forward despite the weight of resentment. Should I have bitten my tongue? Should I have just let him indulge? But beneath that question lurked a deeper one: was I wrong for wanting recognition? Days turned into weeks, and while practical matters continued as they always did, I felt the shift, how we danced around each other more carefully, like two actors performing in a play where the audience was unaware of the tension building offstage. I found solace in the quiet of night when I could replay our childish skirmish, flesh and blood memories tinged with bitterness, wondering if we were just prolonging the inevitable, forcing ourselves through to the end of a dull script. And then, one evening, as I flicked through Netflix in a desperate bid to create a new shared experience, I offered to make dinner. Maybe my gesture would be perceived as an olive branch. But after gathering ingredients and cooking a meal for two, I hesitantly beckoned Eric to our table, fiery lights dancing against the walls, and proposed we eat together instead of watching another episode without so much as a glance or a word exchanged. He looked up, reluctance flickering across his face as he joined me, but the table was a quiet battlefield once again, simmering words lingering in the corners of our postures. I couldn't hold back the flood anymore, all those hidden truths threatening to explode, the silence we'd sustained too long wrapped around our throats. You know, I called you selfish for a reason because you're not the only one hurting here, I said, heart racing, pouring out my frustration, and finally giving way to the aching loneliness I felt. His brow furrowed as if I had disturbed some old, long-buried pain. When he finally spoke, it was in a whisper laced with vulnerability. I didn't mean to shut you out. I thought Fruit Loops would fill a void. I didn't realize I had created another. In that moment, I understood what we'd both been trying to stave off: the hurt, the apathy, the mounting discontent. But what terrified me more than the fight over a bowl of cereal was the recognition that maybe the things we felt compelled to fight over were only reflections of the storms brewing beneath the surface. And that night, instead of cereal becoming our destruction, it transformed into something unexpected, an offering of understanding, a chance to heal the wounds left festering in the shadows. We each took a slice of the truth, and through the darkness, the glow of hope started to dance in the periphery, a tiny flicker promising that even the smallest battles could become the beginning of something new. And as we sat there, spooning in unison, I realized sometimes it takes a bowl of cereal to really see each other again. I never thought attending my aunt's baby shower would lead to the kind of nightmare I could barely comprehend, but looking back, the entire day felt like a slow-motion train wreck that I could do nothing to stop. The moment I stepped into her lavishly decorated living room, filled with pastel-colored balloons and annoyingly cute decorations, a sense of dread washed over me. My aunt, who had always been the fun relative, was now the center of attention for her impending motherhood, and I was just a reluctant guest somewhat dragged into it by family obligations. As we congregated in a circle, playing those absurd games no one genuinely enjoyed, I felt the weight of the pressure to put on a smile, pretend I cared, and above all, be respectful, even though I knew I had no intention of doing so. You see, I had secretly vowed not to attend if the invitation didn't specifically ask for me. In essence, it was a pity invite, and I wasn't about to humor her for the sake of appearances. She could hardly keep her enthusiasm in check as she opened gifts, which only added fuel to my frustration. As she unwrapped yet another onesie garnished with cartoon elephants, the urge to unleash my disdain boiled inside me, colliding with the social facade I was trying to uphold. That's when my cousin's judgmental gaze caught mine. It was one of those looks that said, "Are you really going to spoil this?" And in that moment, I snapped. Without thinking, I blurted, "You should have picked a different theme, Aunt Linda, this one just screams desperately trying to cope with reality." The room fell silent. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the awkward shifting of chairs. Aunt Linda's smile faltered, her hands froze midair, cradling a pastel gift bag. What I now realized was a colossal faux pas on my part that I could never take back. I thought I might hear laughter, perhaps even a sarcastic comment to lighten the mood, but it was only my heart pounding in my ears as embarrassment washed over her and me in equal measure. She tried to laugh it off, a strange sound that only added to the tension, but the damage was done. Cousins exchanged glances, probably wondering what kind of monster they had in their family. As the clock ticked by, so did my humiliation, morphing into something darker. I could sense my aunt's dwindling excitement, like a balloon slowly deflating, and suddenly the quaint surroundings felt sinister, as if the pastel decorations were laughing at me. The whispers began, not just about my comment but about my intentions. I was somehow branded the villain of the day, the one who could not tolerate the simple joy of family. And then, the lights flickered, subtle at first, like a knowing wink, but with each passing moment, they gradually dimmed further until it felt like the room had shifted entirely. I could hear the sound of muffled conversations echoing around the walls, each echoed word dripping with disdain towards me even as more presents were opened, but what really unnerved me was the realization that with each present emptied of its novelty, my aunt seemed to grow smaller, lost beneath the heaps of expectation. As cupcakes were served, I could taste the bitterness of my own words lingering on my tongue, and the silence thickened as if we were all trapped in a bubble too surreal to puncture. Unable to bear the atmosphere any longer, I left the room, mumbling something about needing water, but what I found was unexpectedly horrifying. The hallway was dark, and my own shadow felt cloaked in a fog, twisting in ways that threatened to swallow me whole. Glancing back, I caught sight of Aunt Linda, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a chilling stillness radiating from her. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind her, something not quite right, a swirling darkness that lurked at the edges of the light, whispering secrets I dared not grasp. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't move as curiosity and fear wrestled within me. Just as I mustered the courage to step closer, the air thickened around me, and I heard a faint melody, almost like a lullaby, that filled the space with weight and melancholy. The kind of song that might soothe an infant while sending shivers up the spines of grown adults. And then in that eerie calm, Aunt Linda turned, and I swear I saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of anger or perhaps disappointment so profound that I understood. In that moment, it was something far deeper than the trivial squabble we just had. I would later wish I had turned back when the last guest left, because the darkness that followed me into the living room wasn't just an absence of light, it enveloped me in a fear I couldn't fully articulate. I could barely follow the stifled conversation as my relatives buzzed about gifts and game scores. A soft sob reached my ears from where Aunt Linda stood, and in that instant of realization, I understood that the baby shower was not merely a celebration, but a last-ditch effort for her sanity amidst the growing anticipation, the kind that had swallowed her long before I opened my mouth. When I finally returned home, exhausted and filled with regret, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in Aunt Linda's house had wrapped around her like a stalker, that they were now straining to break free, dragging her down into a world that would never be the same again. And soon, I had to face the truth. Sometimes, an unfiltered moment of honesty could unravel something fragile, something unwanted, leaving me wondering just how far I had crossed the line of being the family embarrassment, and if I might have awakened something darker within her that no one else would have to confront but me. Days passed into weeks, and every time my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Linda, I hesitated, knowing that the silence between us had morphed into a chasm too wide to bridge. I'd come to realize that perhaps my failure to exhibit tact was not purely about a single moment, but about something profound. Her descent after the shower had spiraled into a silence filled with shadows that felt tragically suffocating. And while I should have reached out with an apology, I remained sequestered in my own turmoil, fearing that each unreturned message was a dagger aimed at the heart of my conscience, pushing me deeper into the abyss of guilt. Little did I know that guilt would soon transform into dread as vague whispers tainted the air around me, and the creeping sense that I had not just embarrassed my aunt but set something free snaked through the cracks of my reality like a shattering dreamscape. And in that unsettling blend of right and wrong, I found myself asking the haunting question that wouldn't let me go. Was I really the villain in this story, or had I merely opened a door that should have remained shut? I always thought the worst pain I could feel was when I found out my parents were getting divorced, but that feeling shifted like quicksand the night my little sister, Lily, came to me with tear-stained cheeks, her voice trembling as she confessed that she had gotten her first period. She was just 11, and the innocence of her childhood streaked through her eyes, now clouded with embarrassment and confusion. I had been bracing myself for a long time, what with the endless conversations overheard at school and the so-called talk my mother gave me 2 years prior, but nothing could prepare me for the look on Lily's face, that mixture of fear and a burgeoning understanding of the chaos that awaited her. I tried to put on a brave face, forcing myself to recall the advice I had read online, about being supportive, about nurturing that bond since we relied on each other like life buoys in an unforgiving sea, even more so now that our parents were consumed by their own turmoil and neglecting us, both lost in their separations. I pulled her into my arms, and as she sobbed quietly against me, I was instantly pulled into a pit where the emotions swirled like a dark tornado, and in that moment I knew I had to step up, to protect her from the harshness of reality. I grabbed a roll of toilet paper and a pad from the bathroom, mind racing, recalling our mom's half-hearted attempts to prepare Lily for this moment. I quickly returned to her, guiding her through the basics, but in doing so, I stumbled upon an unsettling reality hidden in the folds of my sister's innocence. She revealed, hesitantly, that the other girls in school mocked her for being late and starting her period, whispered cruel jokes about how unsophisticated she was while hinting at something I feared she'd overheard about girls turning into women. I assured her it was normal, that our bodies had a way of doing things at their own pace, but as I said it, guilt gnawed at my insides, eating away at my conscience. How could I comfort her when I knew that what lay ahead would likely be filled with heartache, loneliness, and fear? We sat there on the edge of her bed, the quiet of night wrapping around us like a cold blanket, and with every wave of her breath against my shoulder, I felt the enormity of her vulnerability resting heavily on me. I tasked myself with being her protector in a world that often felt far too dark and unforgiving. I promised her that she wouldn't have to go through this alone, that I would always be there. Little did I know, those words would lead us down a path none of us were prepared for. The next day, Lily seemed different, almost more mature, as if a weight had somehow settled into her. I didn't take long before I began to feel something changing within myself, too, like some awful mirroring effect was taking place. In my quest to become her shield, I found myself swallowed by her emotional storm, helplessly caught in the eye where everything around us felt disorienting. I began to notice things. She developed new friends, appeared distant, but the worst part was the way I sensed something festering beneath her surface, like an unfathomable darkness or perhaps that deep sorrow that lingered behind her eyes. I wanted to speak to her, to coax out the shadows that now seemed to dance around her, but every time I did, she would brush me off with an insistent wave of her hand. One night, fueled by concern, I crept into her room after our parents had gone to bed. She was still awake, buried under the glow of her cell phone, and I plopped down next to her. I didn't even need to ask when she shifted, revealing a chat filled with messages that were thrusting her further into a world I didn't understand, middle school dramas, hints of early romances, and then, hammering home the point, someone had sent her a picture that left me cold. It was explicit, shocking, and everything a part of me wanted to shield her from. I felt furious. No, it was rage boiling underneath. How could anyone do that to someone so young? Without thinking twice, I confronted her gently, asking who was sending these things, our conversation turning sharp and painful as I realized she hadn't grasped the true weight of what she was dealing with. In that moment, too many emotions washed over me, but most of all was a feeling of isolation. I couldn't figure out how to help her, how to explain the monsters that lurked in the shadows without utterly breaking her spirit. Days turned into weeks, marked by evenings spent tiptoeing around her feelings while leaving me in the dark as she continued to withdraw. The minute she slipped out of my sight, it felt like I watched her die a little more every day, unraveling from love and into something that, well, what? I started to piece things together, realizing she began skipping classes, never mentioning who she was with, and then one day, she didn't come home at all. My heart crashed and burned in swirls of chaos as I called her friends, her school, my hands trembling in utter panic. Each second she remained away felt like ice carving into my veins until finally, as dusk set in, she sauntered through the door, seemingly unfazed by the hours spent being lost. As I bolted to her side, I searched her downcast eyes for answers, feeling that primal instinct to protect her surge one last time. When I asked where she was, she bristled, snapped back like a taut string before slipping into silence. I grabbed her arm, desperation creeping under my skin, and that was when things took a twisted turn. I felt fire ignite within her gaze, a fierce rebellion that she was beginning to nurture, and in the split second I had touched her, something deep inside flickered. I didn't expect her to lash out, her entire being springing into life, demanding that I back off. In that moment, I knew I had gone too far, that I had unintentionally shoved her closer to the edge. I hadn't voiced the words that were screaming in my mind. I was afraid that forcing her to reveal herself would only make her run further into that abyss. A part of me didn't want her to feel like I was another adult trying to control her. I had hoped to be her ally, her refuge, but she stomped upstairs, slamming the door in my face, and my heart shattered. For the next few days, I treaded carefully around the house, tiptoeing as if walking on shards of glass, instinctively holding my breath each time I heard her room creak. Then, another vision of anger flashed unveiled. I could feel my heart thundering as I heard muffled laughter from her direction, friends gathering outside to tease, and I saw them, those girls I had never approved of before. Who were they? I wanted to know why they were allowed to drag her into their world when it seemed to drip with deceit. I was about to barge out there, to pull her back, but suddenly I stopped. I felt this cold wave of clarity, recognizing that if I did invade her space, my little sister may very well tumble into an abyss far darker than what I had imagined. Instead, I chose silence, wrestling with the demons of self-doubt feeling heavy on my shoulders. Days blurred into months like an out-of-focus movie reel, and soon, my worst fears became reality. I found myself sitting across from a counselor, poring over the underlying pains that now accompanied our family, the way it twisted into this labyrinth of hurt, questioning where I had failed in being a sibling, and somewhere along the lines, I realized I had handed her over to those shadows, letting those dark forces seep through like poison into her very core. The last few weeks since we had that fight left me shattered. Late-night phone calls from parents screaming over the phone made everything tragic, like a play for a performance nobody wanted to witness. I felt the sting each time I saw her retreat into the darkness, feeling helpless behind my own walls, and knowing I would likely remain in the background while she began to spiral down that path without me. What hurt most was the knowledge that, while I had desperately tried to be her savior, I had ultimately failed in one crucial aspect. I didn't truly understand that stepping up meant giving her the space to figure out her identity without my controlling shadow looming over. The question haunted me, echoing incessantly, was I truly right or utterly selfish in wanting to drag her back from that darkness? What I had to learn, and what I hoped she could too, was that the road toward each other may be laden with shadows, but if she were in the darkness, I would be waiting for her beacon light, hoping she wasn't too far from remembering how to shine. I always thought high school drama was exaggerated in movies, but nothing could have prepared me for what unfurled one fateful Friday afternoon as I shoved my books into my backpack with trembling hands, my mind racing with anxiety over the upcoming prom. I had a casual friendship with Ethan, a guy who was smart and funny but had prolonged his geeky phase through all 4 years of school, and though he had a crush on me, I could never consider him as a prom partner, not with there being a big social hierarchy that I was desperately trying to navigate. It was already bad enough that Jenna and her clingy normie crew were constantly whispering about me, labeling me the loner who dared to choose her own path outside of their cliques. It was just supposed to be a night of fun and dancing, but I couldn't shake off the pressure of finding the perfect date to prove I belonged. As if the universe were mocking me, my phone buzzed with notifications, each one signaling a growing storm, Jenna's endless posts on social media revealing her preparation for the big night, and my heart sank as I saw her prime date, a popular guy, laugh and bewitch everyone with his charm. That morning, I had finally made it clear to Ethan that he wasn't my type. I had taken care to soften the blow but left him crushed nonetheless. Then came the worst part, his mother decided to confront me. She found me waiting at the school gates, her eyes sharp and probing, like those of a hawk who has spotted something amiss. "My son told me you've decided not to take him to prom," she said, her voice laced with aggression. I offered her a polite smile, trying to diffuse the rising tension, but she bulldozed right through it. "You need to look at your own choices," she insisted, drawing nearer, the scent of her cheap perfume wrapping tightly around me, like a noose. I could feel myself becoming dizzy, trapped in a suffocating spiral of anger and fear. The nerve of her, accusing me of ruining her son's prom when they hadn't even asked themselves the question that mattered: why would I choose someone who spent most of his time obsessing over comics and video games? "Listen," I managed to say, my voice steadier than my shaking hands, "I'd for telling you to look at your son before blaming me. He's sweet, but he deserves someone who cherishes him, not just someone looking for a pity date." Time felt suspended as silence enveloped us. I braced myself for the explosion, my heart hammering in my chest, but just as her mouth opened, I caught sight of Ethan watching from a distance, his expression unreadable, a mix of shock and sorrow. Something in me broke at that moment, my conscience screamed at the pile of unnecessary blame heaped upon me. But then the mother hissed, "Don't think for one moment that this is over. You will regret this." The ominous chill in her tone cut right through my initial bravado, leaving an unsettling knot in my stomach. I left school that day haunted by my words, wrestling with fear that I'd crossed an unseen line, and as promised, the worst followed. First it was small things, a flat tire on the way home, bizarre coincidences that felt like the universe was suddenly aligning against me. But at prom, things escalated viciously. Jenna and her gang surrounded me, each pitiful story swinging like a pendulum, as they mercilessly dissected my past choices in the light of social media turmoil, revealing the ugly underbelly of high school politics. I felt like a pariah, watching them tear down everything I thought I'd done right, with every smug remark layered with laughter. Just as it seemed I'd reached the lowest point of despair, the lights dimmed in the hall and the music thumped, drowning out Jenna's taunts momentarily. It felt almost cinematic as I moved towards the punch bowl, desperate for solace. But then, behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of a throat being cleared. I turned around to see Ethan, his mother lurking behind him, her eyes glinting in the dark like a predator ready to pounce. "You think this is over?" She snarled again, and before I could respond, I bolted towards the exit, adrenaline surging through my veins, only to find myself cornered in a dimly lit supply room where she followed, her intentions written clearly across her face. I desperately scanned for an escape route, but she was too quick, locking the door behind her, trapping me in this nightmare. "You think you can just turn him down and not expect consequences? You need to realize who you're dealing with," she said, her voice like ice. My heart raced. I tried to explain myself, but the words were lost amid the mounting terror. For a fleeting instant, Ethan appeared in the threshold, reaching for the handle, but his mother grasped my arm tightly, her grip unyielding, fixing me with a crazed expression, as if laced with a dark, hidden madness. "You're going to pay for breaking his heart. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth about you," she hissed it like a curse, and in that instant, an overwhelming wave of helplessness gripped me, my nights of dread crashing into unbearable terror. My cell phone buzzed in my pocket, a true signal from the outside world, and with a jolt I reached in to find a series of frantic messages from friends, some concerning their own safety at home. But I had less time than I thought. Ethan finally managed to force the door open, and just as he did, his mother released her hold on me, and I stumbled backward into a wall. She turned to him, her face now a canvas of rage and grief, and with one swift, disarming gesture, she transformed from the predator to the victim, screeching about betrayal and ungrateful girls. I stepped back, panic and disbelief dancing between us as Ethan stood there, frozen, jaws clenched, his eyes darting from me to his mother, that one moment a lifetime of silence. I could see the flicker of realization overwhelm his features, as he turned away from her, and in that tense, split second, the promise of something both terrifying and liberating dawned within me. "Ethan, it's okay," I blurted out. "There's more to you than any of this." I would never forget the look on his face as he eventually stepped back, the weight of his past shattering under the reality of who he could be. As his mother shrieked one last time, the moment spiraled until it burst into 1,000 fragments, but one thing was clear: I was done being their scapegoat, their pawn in a game I didn't choose to play. The horror of their vindictive pull fluttered away as I stepped into the light, the weight of that night turning into fuel igniting my resolve to find my own way, uncaged from the illusion of what prom should have been. Some choices felt like chains, but I realized some were roads that led right back to dignity. All it took was the courage to walk away. A few weeks later, as high school faded into something only an afterthought, I discovered Ethan had unfollowed his mother on social media, cutting her negative influence clean from his life. And while I never heard from his mother again, the memory of that encounter lingered, a reminder of the darkness that once threatened to engulf me, a specter now banished under the light of a new beginning. I never imagined I'd be embroiled in a battle of morality with my sister, especially not after a long day that started with the usual chaos of life with my own kids. But my phone rang in the middle of a meeting, and it was like my heart stopped when I saw her name. Sarah never calls unless it's an emergency. You need to come to the school now, she snapped, and it felt like ice water poured into my veins. What's happening? I asked, dread crawling under my skin like a swarm of ants. It's Liam. He's waiting for me, and I forgot to pick him up. In that moment, the world around me blurred. My mind replayed the image of my sweet, innocent nephew, all big brown eyes, and that shy smile, waiting all alone in a cold, unwelcoming cafeteria long after the bell had rung. I felt a surge of rage and disbelief. How could she leave him there? You put your phone on Do Not Disturb? Are you kidding me? I yelled, my voice rising in disbelief. She dismissed my concern with a wave of her hand, as if this was just a minor inconvenience. It's just a kid. He'll be fine until I get there, she responded too casually, shrugging her shoulder as if it was no big deal that her first grader was more vulnerable than a single light bulb flickering in a pitch-black room. I was enraged, imagining that little boy, staring at those doors, waiting for the only adult who he thought would pick him up, and instead, feeling the creeping realization that he'd been forgotten. My voice echoed through the phone, louder and sharper than I intended. You need to stop acting like this is acceptable behavior. What kind of person just leaves their child behind? What are you thinking? And as soon as I said it, I felt a chill run down my spine as if something sinister was watching from the shadows. I drove to the school, every nerve ending in my body aflame with anxiety, imagining all the worst-case scenarios, the cruelty of older kids, the indifference of teachers, and the emptiness of that cafeteria. When I arrived, I burst through the doors. My sister was already there, but it wasn't her face I was looking for, it was my nephew. My heart raced as I scanned the space, and then I spotted him at a corner table, head resting on crossed arms, a pathetic, lonely figure surrounded by the echoes of laughter from children who had long since reunited with their parents. Liam. I called out, my breath hitching as he looked up, his tear-stained cheeks sending a dagger through my heart. He sprinted to me, wrapping his little arms around my waist as if I were the last lifeline in a drowning sea, and I couldn't hold back my own tears. Why didn't Mommy come? He whispered, his voice thick with confusion. I couldn't answer, as rage bubbled up anew along with maternal instinct. I turned to Sarah, my voice low but fierce. How could you do this to him? But the confrontation was interrupted by the school principal, a stern gaze beneath her thick glasses. I really need to speak with you both, she said, and her tone suggested this was more than just a simple late pickup. We were ushered to her office where she would reveal a deep concern for Liam's well-being, her voice grave. We've had reports of disturbing incidents in the area lately, she said, and my blood turned to ice. Children have gone missing after school hours. My heart dropped as the implications sank in, visions of what could have happened to Liam racing through my mind like a runaway train. I looked at Sarah, her face pale as she glanced at Liam, who now stood wide-eyed, oblivious to the danger that could have befallen him. I didn't know. She finally gasped, the reality of her negligence crashing down with the weight of 1,000 boulders. Everything changed in that moment. I could see her fear reflected in Liam's face, and it was then that I understood. She wasn't just careless, she was lost in a world of her own, one that wouldn't allow her to hear the tiny voice of her son, or the muffled cries for help of countless others trapped in their phones or their own minds. The principal continued, children need their parents more than ever, especially during these times. As she explained more about the cases in the area, I felt the air grow thick around us, suffocating. I had imagined a confrontation filled with shouting and blame, but instead, we were faced with the reality that we weren't just failing ourselves but the very ones we sought to protect. My anger morphed into deep sadness, the kind that grips you and doesn't let go, leaving room only for fear. My accusations hung in the air heavy, yet silent, while all I could hear was Liam's soft breaths and the distant voices of children still laughing outside, oblivious to the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. What haunted me then was the realization that perhaps, long before this incident, Sarah didn't just need me to yell. She needed me there, to guide her and Liam from whatever darkness she had fallen into, and that made me angrier than the reckless act itself. The principal's voice faded into a blur, warnings turning into echoes, while I held Liam close, swaying gently in a world now filled with shadows, not knowing if we'd ever truly be free of the hidden fears that lurk behind our screens, threatening to dissolve the fabric of our most sacred connections. How much longer could it go on like this? I never considered myself an overly dramatic person, but the night I sent that text to Claire felt like something snapped inside me. It wasn't just a day of frustration but the culmination of months watching my supposed best friend slip away into her endless cycle of busy with no space for the people who actually cared about her. The backstory was simple. Claire had always been the life of the party, the friend who could charm anyone into laughing, but as soon as she landed that promotion, everything changed. Texts went unanswered for days, outings were forgotten or rescheduled, and each time I reached out, her excuse felt more like an avalanche burying us further apart rather than a mountain we could climb together. After what seemed like a final straw, I shot her a message that echoed with my resentment. AITA for telling my friend she can get back in touch when she stops being perpetually busy? I put my phone down and immediately regretted my harsh words, yet part of me felt vindicated, a sense that finally, I'd said what I'd been too scared to articulate for so long. Claire's response wasn't immediate. Instead, there was a deafening silence that made me revisit all those memories we had, the laughter, the late-night talks, the promises of sticking together no matter what. Slowly, dread crept in, replaced by guilt, as I started to wonder if I'd really lost her for good. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day my initial fury waned into a dull ache of longing, until one night, I was awoken from a fitful sleep by a sudden vibration from my phone, my heart racing as I saw Claire's name on the screen. But when I opened her message, dread fueled the rush of blood to my face. She was apologizing, but not like I hoped. Claire hinted at her busy life, but there was something heavier, almost ominous in the words. "You don't understand," she wrote, followed by a string of excuses that could have been relatable if not for that unshakable feeling clawing at my mind, a chill that whispered that it was more than just a busy schedule. Ignoring the pull in my gut, I pushed back. I told her to stop the excuses and pushed her for the truth about what had really changed. A bad idea, I guess. I should have let it go, let her come back when she was able to face me again instead of poking through her life like a curious child, because that only escalated the tension between us. In my next message, I asked pointedly, "What does busy really mean for you?" And with that second text sent, it felt like a match struck in a dark room. Her silence morphed into something heavier than I could have anticipated. Suddenly, weeks became a winding path of vague acknowledgments and exchanges tinged with tension until she finally agreed to meet. When we did meet, she looked different, like an entire universe had passed between us. Her eyes were shadowed, cheeks sunken, and her words trembled with a weight I couldn't comprehend. As we sat in the dimly lit cafe, every small talk fell flat. All I could think of was that the light in her had dimmed, almost as if all the joy I knew was trapped somewhere in her busy life. So I desperately grasped for answers, and when I asked her point blank what had really happened, her fingers went still, the air thickened, and her eyes darted around before whispering a confession that sent ice through my veins. "It's not just my job," she said, her voice trembling. "You're not the only one feeling left behind." And when she took a deep breath, I held back tears, bracing for a horror that her words carried, a revelation of how deeply the busy facade had become a shield for something darker. She spoke of a man she didn't know anymore, of late-night calls that turned sinister, and friends whose busy lives were mere distractions from deeper problems, of her struggles and the friends replaced by shadows, until the connection hit harder than a punch. I was losing her, slipping away into a world I couldn't reach. Before I could respond, Claire's face drained of color, and she shot a glance toward the door. Chilled by the sudden urgency in her eyes, I turned just in time to see a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the threshold of the cafe, a silhouette with a familiar air that sent chills down my spine. I tried to ignore the rising panic, but Claire's reaction was telling. She jumped to her feet, gripping my arm. "We have to go, now," she urged, and the desperation in her voice sent my heart racing. We bolted out into the streets, and as her shaky hands held the door open, I felt that something was hunting us, a relentless specter lurking in the shadows of our conversations, waiting to pull Claire back into whatever darkness stalked her. We spent the next few hours zigzagging through back alleys, weaving in and out of shops until finally, we collapsed into a cramped diner, both gasping for breath. As we sat there, the weight of unspoken secrets loomed over us like a storm, and while I tried desperately to convince her to share the stories that gnawed at her, the look in her eyes told me more than words could. She was scared, not just of whatever hunted her, but of revealing the truth that had been clawing at her for so long. It was in that moment I realized the gravity of my message. This busy life of hers was more than just a job, it was a barrier, a desperate attempt to keep the shadows at bay. I made a silent promise to myself, a promise to break through the fear that bound her even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. But the night didn't end there, and right as we decided to head out, wrapped in our resolve, there it was again, the distant hum of bad energy, a sense of ice stalking us just out of sight. Our instincts kicked in, fears bubbling to the surface, culminating in an unspoken understanding that, whatever passed between us was not finished. And as we ducked and weaved through the darkness, I felt the familiar weight of haunting echoes, every unanswered message, every ignored call, every vicious cycle. It all came crashing down. Claire had been drowning this entire time, and I had been blind.